House Called Awful End. The Eddie Dickens Trilogy 1 by Phillip, Ardagh. A message to my American readers at no extra cost. Greetings from across the Atlantic. I'm so delighted that A House Called Awful End has been published in the United States that I want to say a few special words to my American readers. Yes, you. The story you're about to read was originally written in installments by nephew Ben, who was at boarding school in England while his parents were living in Russia. Instead of sending up letters about how many cups of tea I drank or how hard it had rained, there's plenty of tea drinking and rain in England. I decided to send him a silly adventure story in installments with a new episode every 2 weeks. The book you now have in your hand or clenched between your teeth if you're very nearsighted or hungry is the result. Of course, when I was writing those letters, I had no idea they'd end up becoming this book, but they did. May our lives be full of such good fortune too. Phillip, Ardagh, 2002. A House Called Awful End. I don't know if you'll be able to actually see any of the illustrations or not. Episode 1, Crinkly Around the Edges. In which Eddie Dickens is sent away for his own good. When Eddie Dickens was 11 years old, both his parents caught some awful disease that made them turn yellow, go a bit crinkly around the edges, and smell of old hot water bottles. There were lots of diseases like that in those days. Perhaps it had something to do with all that thick fog, those knobby cobbled streets, and the fact that everyone went everywhere by horse, even to the bathroom. Who knows? It's very contagious, said his father, and catching, said his mother, sucking on an ice cube shaped like a famous general. They were in Eddie's parents' bedroom, which was very dark and dingy and had no furniture in it, except for a large double bed, an even larger wardrobe, and 32 different types of chair designed to make you sit up straight even if your wrists were handcuffed to your ankles. Why are you sucking an ice cube shaped like a famous general? Eddie asked his parents, who were propped up against piles of pillows in their impressively ugly double bed. Dr. Muffin says that it helps with the swelling, said his mother. In fact, because she had a famous general-shaped ice cube in her mouth, what she actually said was, Dr. Muffin says that it helps with swelling. But Eddie managed to translate. What swelling? He asked politely. His mother shrugged, then suddenly looked even more yellow and even more crinkly around the edges. And why do they have to be famous general-shaped? Asked Eddie. He always asked lots of questions, and whenever he asked lots of questions, his father would say, Questions, questions. Questions, questions, said his father. Told you. But why a famous general? Eddie repeated. Surely the shape of the ice cube can't make any difference. Shows how much you know, muttered his mother, which meant and still means shows how much you know. His father rustled the bedclothes. One does not question the good doctor, he said, especially when one is a child. He was a small man except for when he was sitting up in bed. In this position, he looked extremely tall. Then Eddie's mother rustled the bedclothes. It was easy to make them rustle because they were made entirely from brown paper bags glued together with those extra strips of gummed paper you sometimes get if you buy more than one stamp at the post office. Postage stamps were a pretty new idea back then, and everyone, except for the great-great-great-aunt on my mother's side of the family, was excited about them. One good thing about there being so few stamps in those days was that no one had yet come up with the idea of collecting them and sticking them in albums and being really boring about them. Stamp collectors didn't exist. Another good thing about there being no stamp collectors was that English teachers couldn't sneak up on some defenseless child and ask it. Teachers even thought of a child as it back then. Some things never change. How to spell philatelist? Anyhow, even for those days, having brown paper bedclothes wasn't exactly usual. Quite the opposite, in fact. Bedclothes used to be an even grander affair then than they are now. There were no polyester-filled duvets with separate washable covers. Oh no, back then there were underblankets and undersheets and top sheets and middle sheets and 7 different kinds of over blankets. These ranged from ones thicker than a plank of wood, but not so soft, to ones that had no holes in them. They were supposed to be there. To make a bed properly, the average chambermaid went through 6 or 7 to 8 weeks training at a special camp. Even then, not all of them finished the course, and those who didn't finish spent the rest of their working lives living in cupboards under stairs. The cupboard under the stairs of the Dickens household was occupied by gibbering Jane. She spent her days in the darkness alongside a variety of mops, buckets, and brooms, mumbling about hospital corners and ruckled chenille. She never came out and was fed slices of ham and any other food that was thin enough to slip under the bottom of the door. The reason why Mr. and Miss Dickens had rustling brown paper sheets and blankets was that this was a part of the treatment. Dr. Muffin was always giving very strict instructions about the treatment. The smell of old hot water bottles had almost reached unbearable on Eddie's one unprepared to breathe scale, and he held his hanky up to his face. "You'll have to leave the room, my boy," said his father. "You'll have to leave the house," said his mother. "We can't risk you going all yellow and crinkly and smelling horrible. It would be a terrible waste of all that money we spent on turning you into a little gentleman." "Which is why we're sending you to stay with Mad Uncle Jack," his father explained. "I didn't know I had a Mad Uncle Jack," gasped Eddie. "You'd never heard of him. He sounded rather an exciting relative to have." "I didn't say your Mad Uncle Jack. He's my Mad Uncle Jack," said his father. "I do wish you'd listen. That makes him your great-uncle." "Oh," said Eddie, disappointed. "You mean Mad Great-Uncle Jack." Then he realized that he hadn't heard of him either, and he sounded just as exciting as the other one. "When will I meet him?" "He's in the wardrobe," said his mother, pointing at the huge wardrobe at the foot of the bed, in case her son had forgotten what a wardrobe looked like. Eddie Dickens pulled open the door of the wardrobe gingerly. It was a ginger wardrobe. Inside, among his mother's dresses, stood a very, very, very tall and very, very thin man, with a nose that made a parrot speak look not so beaky. "Hello," he said, with a U and not with an E. It was very definitely a hello and not a hello. Mad Uncle Jack put out his hand. Eddie shook it. His little gentleman lessons hadn't been completely wasted. Mad Uncle Jack stepped out of the wardrobe and onto an oval mat, knitted by children from St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. Remember that place, St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. There, I've written it out for you a second time. Never let it be said that I don't do anything for you. Remember the name. You'll come across it again one day, and probably between the covers of this book. "So you are Edmund Dickens," said Mad Uncle Jack, studying the boy. "Yes, sir," said Eddie, because his first name really was Edmund. Eddie Dickens' father cleared his throat. He used a miniature version of the sort of brush the local sweep used to clear blocked chimneys. This was all a part of Dr. Muffin's treatment. "Edmund," said Dr. Dickens, "you are to go with my uncle and live with him until your dear sweet mother and I—" He paused and kissed Miss Dickens on the part of her face that was the least yellow and the least crinkly at the edges, a small section just behind her left ear. "Are well again. You must never wear anything green in his presence. You must always drink at least 5 glasses of lukewarm water a day, and you must always do as he says. Is that clear?" "Yes, father," said Eddie. "And Jonathan," added his mother, for Jonathan was the pet name she called Eddie when she couldn't remember his real one. "Yes, mother, do be careful to make sure that you're not mistaken for a runaway orphan and taken to the orphanage, where you will then suffer cruelty, hardship, and misery." "Don't worry, mother, that'll never happen," said Eddie Dickens, dismissing the idea as ridiculous. If only he'd listened. Mad Uncle Jack wanted to see the bathroom before he went, and being unfamiliar with the house, he found it difficult to get his horse up the stairs without knocking 1 or 2 family portraits off the wall. The fact that he'd only nailed the portraits up there himself minutes before made it all the more annoying. He took the paintings with him whenever he stayed more than 11 miles from his house. Because his house was actually 12 miles from the nearest place, that meant he always had them with him. A key part of the treatment was that neither Mr. Dickens nor his wife, Miss Dickens, should leave the bed more than 3 times a day, because they had both already been out twice that day, and both planned to get out later for an arm wrestling competition against the friends and neighbors of Mr. and Miss Thackeray, who lived over at the Grange. Neither of Eddie's parents could get out to see him off. Instead, the bed was lowered from the window on a which, constructed from the sheets that were no longer in use since the treatment had begun. "Good luck, my boy," said Eddie's father. "Under such extreme circumstances I would kiss you, but I don't want you catching this. Get well, father," said Eddie, "Be good, Simon," said his mother. Simon was the name Miss Dickens used when she couldn't remember that his real name was Edmund, or that his pet name was Jonathan. "Be good." "I will," said Eddie. "Get well, mother." It started to rain, and the raindrops mixed with the tears that poured down his mother's face. She was busy peeling an onion. Episode 2, Even Madder Maud, in which Eddie first meets Malcolm, or is it Sally? When Eddie Dickens climbed into Mad Uncle Jack's covered carriage, he found that it was already occupied. In the corner an elderly woman was stroking a stoat. "You must be Malcolm," said the old woman, with a voice that could grate cheese. "No, madame, my name is Edmund," said Eddie. "I was talking to the stoat," snarled the woman, pulling the creature closer to her. "Well?" she demanded, staring at the animal. The stoat said nothing. It didn't even twitch or blink. The woman seized it by the tail and held it aloft, which in those days language for "up a bit." It was as stiff as a board. "Are you Malcolm?" she demanded. It was around about then that Eddie Dickens realized the woman must be completely crazy and that the animal must be completely stuffed. He took a seat opposite the woman. "Put that seat back," she screamed, so Eddie did as he was told and sat down. Just then Mad Uncle Jack stuck his thinnest of thin heads through the door of the carriage. "Ignore her, she's quite mad," he said gruffly. "Who is she, sir?" asked Eddie. "Sally Stoat," said his great-uncle. "Did she get her name from that stuffed animal she's hugging?" asked Eddie. "It was the Stoat I was referring to, you impudent whelp," cried his great-uncle. "That good lady is my wife, Mad Aunt Maud, your great-aunt, and there's most certainly nothing mad about her." Eddie's face went beetroot red. "I do beg your pardon, great-uncle," Eddie spluttered. "And you, great-aunt," he said, with terrible embarrassment. He hadn't even left the driveway of his own home, and he had already managed to offend them both. "Enough said," Mad Uncle Jack. "I despise closed carriages, so shall be lashing myself to the roof along with your luggage. I shall see you when we reach Awful End." "Awful End?" "Our home. Your home, until your dear mother and father are cured of their terrible afflictions," Mad Uncle Jack explained. Eddie's great-uncle clambered onto the roof, where Eddie could hear him strapping himself to place next to his trunk. "Drive on," Mad Uncle Jack shouted. Nothing happened. "Driver," he instructed, "drive on." It was then that he must have remembered that they didn't have a driver. Eddie could hear him unstrapping himself and then clambering across the roof above his head to take up position in the driver's chair. Mad Uncle Jack gave a strange clicking noise that you sometimes hear people make to horses moments before they flick reins and the carriage pulls off. Eddie thought he even heard the flicking of the reins, but this was followed by silence except for the gentle patter of raindrops that were falling onto the stuffed stoat that his great-aunt was sticking out of the open window. "Did you have a good war, dear?" she asked Eddie. "What war was that, great-aunt?" Eddie asked politely. "How many have you been in?" she asked. "None, as a matter of fact," said Eddie. She was as tricky to talk to as her husband. "Then don't be so particular," she replied, pulling the stoat back into the dry of the carriage. "Was Malcolm thirsty, was he? Did he like his little drinky?" "No horse," called out a voice that Eddie recognized as belonging to his father, even though it sounded more yellow and crinkly at the edges than usual. Eddie stood up and looked out of the window across the driveway to his parents, who were sitting by the front door of their bed. The weather wasn't doing their bedclothes much good. The brown paper bags looked a darker brown and were positively soggy. If his parents stayed out much longer, the bedding would soon turn to pulp. Eddie suspected that papier-mâché wasn't a part of Dr. Muffin's treatment. "No horse," his father repeated, pointing to the front of the carriage. Eddie climbed out, stepped onto the driveway, and looked back at the carriage. He could see the problem. In the carriage sat Mad Aunt Maud with her stuffed stoat, by the name of either Malcolm or Sally, depending on who he was to believe. On the roof of the carriage were Eddie's trunk and his great-uncle's family's portraits that went with them always, and at the front of the carriage was his very thin and very mad Uncle Jack, reins in one hand and a whip in the other. But the problem was, and Mr. Dickens had put it very well, there was Nohorse. "Your great-uncle left him in the bathroom," Miss Dickens shouted, wiping away a tear from the corner of her eye. If the truth be told, what she actually shouted was, "Your great-uncle left him in a barfru," because she had a whole peeled onion in her mouth. A moment later, Mr. Dickens' gentleman led the horse out of the house and hitched into Mad Uncle Jack's carriage. "Thank you, Daphne," said Mad Uncle Jack. "Very good, sir," replied the gentleman's gentleman. As a gentleman's gentleman, he knew that it was not his place to point out that he was not actually called Daphne, but Dawkins. No, this place was a large basket in the kitchen with plenty of tissue paper, and he couldn't complain. Mr. Thackeray's gentleman over at the Grange was far worse off. His place was on a small log behind a coal scuttle in the tackle room. Dawkins hadn't the slightest idea what a tackle room was, but he had never thought to ask. With the horse now in position, the carriage pulled away and they were off. Eddie waved out of the window with his parents until they became small dots in the distance. Perhaps this was part of their illness, or perhaps it had to do with the perspective of it being a very long driveway. "I think you should remove your clothes now," said Aunt Maud as the carriage bumped along the wheel ruts of an unmade-up road. If Eddie Dickens had been beetroot red with embarrassment before, now he had gone blushing beetroot red. "I beg your pardon," he said, hoping that he hadn't heard aright. He had. "I said I think you should remove your clothes," she confirmed. Why might that be, Aunt Maud?" he inquired as politely as possible, wishing that he was anywhere else in the whole world than in a carriage with this woman. "If you wear all those clothes in here, you will have nothing to put on when we step out of the carriage, and then you will be cold," said Aunt Maud. "I should have thought that was perfectly obvious. But I'll be cold here in the meantime, Great Aunt," Eddie was quick to point out. Great Aunt Maud glared at him. If looks could kill, he would have been seriously injured by this one. "Have you ever thought of growing a mustache?" she asked suddenly. "I'm only 11, Eddie protested. "Quiet," snapped Aunt Maud. "I was asking Malcolm here." She gave the stuffed stoat a friendly rub between its glass eyes. The stuffed stoat said nothing. Eddie wondered if he'd be able to survive a whole journey sharing a carriage with this lunatic. At least, she seemed to have forgotten about telling him to take his clothes off. "Now come on, young man," said Aunt Maud. "Remove them at once," Eddie groaned. To break the journey, Mad Uncle Jack stopped at a coaching inn called the Coaching Inn. It was an unimaginative part of the countryside, and to call it anything other than the Coaching Inn might have confused both the locals and the passing trade. Both the locals were there to greet Mad Uncle Jack's party. They were the landlord and landlady, Mr. and Miss Loaf. Neither of them batted an eyelid when Eddie stepped from the carriage wearing nothing but his undershirt and a pair of long johns. In those days, wearing nothing but your undershirt and long johns was considered being underdressed. You couldn't really get much more naked than that. If there had been movie theaters in those days, which then there weren't, and they had shown a film of someone on the beach wearing nothing but his undershirt and long johns, there would have been outrage. Men and large beards would have set up barricades, and there would have been riots in the street. Most people went through life without realizing that they could actually remove their undershirts and long johns. They simply assumed that they were a part of them, like fingernails and hair. They simply assumed that these undergarments were their skin, made out of a different material from their face, hands, and feet, with buttons on them. If anyone had appeared in just a pair of boxer shorts or swimming trunks, the one menfolk would have had an attack of the vapors, and the menfolk would have exploded in a rage at the indecency of it. What exactly an attack of the vapors was is unclear, because there is no such thing as womenfolk anymore, and there is certainly no such thing as an attack of the vapors. If a person did suffer from such an attack in Eddie Dickens' day, however, it seemed to involve a high-pitched squeal of swooning and a falling to the ground or floor with much crumpling of the dress. The way to assist a gentlewoman after such an attack was to wave a small bottle labeled smelling salts beneath her nose. As with an attack of the vapors, smelling salts don't exist today either, nor do bath salts. Everyone uses bubble bath or shower gel instead, which is all very interesting. As a result, when Eddie stepped out of the carriage outside the coaching inn, he felt as naked as you would when they're completely in the nudity except for your watch, despite the fact that he was wearing more clothes than the rest of us would wear on an ordinary day at the seaside. He therefore expected both of the locals, the landlord and landlady, Mr. and Miss Loaf, to be horrified, but not at all. "This is Master Eddie," Mad Uncle Jack explained, climbing down and standing beside his great-nephew. "Please arrange to have him stabled and arrange for 2 rooms, one for me and my good lady wife, and one for my horse." "Very good, lad, Mr. Dickens," said Miss Loaf. She obviously knew Mad Uncle Jack well, but it would be rude to call him Mad Uncle Jack, because she wasn't one of the family. This way, please, though I do wish you weren't staying." While his great-aunt and great-uncle, and then Horace, were shown to the rooms by his wife, Mr. Loaf led Eddie to the stables. "You'll sleep in here," he said. "There's plenty of straw, so you should be warm and comfortable." "But why should I have to sleep out here while the horse gets to sleep in the inn?" asked Eddie, trying not to sound too pathetic and helpless. "Perhaps your great-uncle can only afford 2 rooms, the landlord suggested. "And then there's the fact that he's completely mad." "Good point," nodded Eddie, shivering a little. "You know, Master Edmund, that great-uncle of yours never pays his bill," Mr. Love continued. "Then why do you let him keep on staying here?" asked Eddie. "Well, he sort of pays, see, but not with money," said the man. He was carrying Eddie's trunk, which he now placed on a few bales of hay. "He pays without money?" asked Eddie Dickens, frantically opening the trunk lid and pulling on the first garment he could find. It was one of Dr. Muffin's chin-to-toe body stockings, which was knitted from coarse black wool and covered him up to his neck. He felt a lot less naked now. "Then what does he pay with?" "Well, usually with dried fish," the landlord of the coaching inn explained. 2 dried hake for a double room per night, and half a halibut for a single room. I never asked him to pay in fish, and I never said he could pay in fish, but pay in fish he always does." "So what do you do with all the dried fish?" asked Eddie, sitting on his trunk. "I send it to your father, and knowing the rates I charge, and the method of fishology by which his uncle pays, he then converts the fish into money and sends me the exact amount." "You know my father?" asked Eddie excitedly. He had only been gone from his parents for half a day, and he was missing them already. This was only the 3rd time in his entire life that he had been away from home, and it felt strange. The first time he had been away from home was when he had been sent to sea. That was from when he was a year old to when he was old enough to go to school. The second time had been from when he was old enough to go to school until his 10th birthday. No wonder it felt so odd in that strange stable. "No, I have never had the honor nor the privilege of meeting your father in person, Master Edmund," said Mr. Lowe, "but we do communicate by post." "Aha," said Eddie. "That would explain the strange parcels my father so often takes to his study. I thought they smelled of dried fish." His eyes lit up. "Your eyes just lit up," said the landlord in complete and utter amazement. "No," said Eddie. "That was just a figure of speech. I thought it had more to do with the body's electricity," said Mr. Lowe. "There was a lot of excitement about electricity in those days before electric light, electric fridges, and electric eels. The last one was a lie. There were most definitely electric eels back then." "How can we be so sure?" "Because Uncle Jack would always tip Mr. Loaf with a dried electric eel at the end of each stay at the coaching inn. He was nothing if not generous, and, as Mr. Loaf so rightly said, completely mad." Wait. I don't think you'll be able to see it. Okay. Episode 3, Mr. Pumblesnook, in which Eddie is entranced by a handkerchief. Eddie found the warmest place to lie was inside his trunk, but he couldn't sleep a wink. It wasn't because he was longer than the trunk, which meant that he'd had to curl himself into a ball. It wasn't because every 10 minutes or so Mad Aunt Maud would burst into the stable, lift the lid of the trunk, and scream, "Not asleep yet?" in that terrible grating voice of hers, with wax dripping onto his face from her upheld candle. It had more to do with the fact that a band of strolling theatricals was rehearsing a play in the far corner of the stable. Strolling theatricals were a strange breed of men and women who used to roam the countryside, forcing unsuspecting yokels, who are locals, who say, "Ooh, ah," instead of yes, to watch something they called performances. A band of strolling theatricals was always led by a man called an actor-manager. You could always recognize an actor-manager from his large frame, from the fact that he always carried a slightly chipped, silver-topped cane. From his booming, ridiculous voice, an actor-manager always used 22 words when one would do, and his blooming, ridiculous name. Most actor-managers were called Mr. Pumblesnook, and Mr. Pumblesnook was no exception. He sat on a bale of hay in the corner of the stable of the coaching inn, barking instructions. "Woof, woof," he said. "Ooh, you really are such a funny man, husband dearest," laughed his wife, who had a number of extremely irritating habits, including pronouncing her R's at W's. "If you don't think that's irritating, just you wait by the time you reach the end of the next page. You'll probably hate her as much as everyone else did." "Ooh, you're the most humorous fellow to have walked this earth, husband dearest," though ain't no denying it," she added, which was a good example of 3 more of her irritating habits. Miss Pumblesnook began all her conversations with the word "ooh," usually with 3 O's, as well as sticking H's in front of words that didn't need them, and as if that weren't enough, she always called Mr. Pumblesnook husband Doust when she was talking to him. So the deaf people weren't spared the irritation she caused. She had a number of awful visual habits, too. Her face was covered with some of the reddest blotches ever to have graced the visage of any human being. This was in the days when people still had visages, remember, and Miss P had the dreadful habit of picking at these blotches with her claw-like nails, and putting any loose skin that came away in a special pocket sewn to the front of her dresses. Another awful habit was that she did with the skin later, but no matter how much you beg, you'll never get me to write that down, never. There was some disagreement as to how she came to have those blotches. Some of the strolling theatricals were convinced that she'd gotten them from drinking her husband's eyebrow embrocation, while others thought they were a result of wearing theatrical makeup every night for over 40 years. What no one disputed was that collecting the flaky skin was quite the most repulsive thing imaginable. But what of Mr. Pumblesnook? He was busy talking his theatricals through a difficult scene of their up-and-coming production. "Remember, attention to the smallest detail reaps the largest of rewards, my children," he bellowed. Eddie groaned. He was never going to sleep, so he might as well just give up. Bleary-eyed and more than a little grouchy, he climbed out of his trunk and wandered across the straw-strewn floor to watch the strolling theatricals at work. "Observe closely the way in which I remove my kerchief from my pocket and give this simplest of acts new meaning in life," Mr. Pumblesnook pronounced. "See how the production of said kerchief becomes more than a mere action and becomes an interpretation of the dramatic flourish." The actor-manager pulled a handkerchief out of his coat pocket. The assembled company, including young Eddie Dickens, burst into spontaneous applause. Eddie had never seen anyone pull out a hanky in such a way. It had been dramatic, exciting. He had cared about that hanky. "Ooh, we have an audience, husband Doust," cried Miss Pumblesnook, spying Eddie and breaking the magic. "We have a little gentleman among us." Mr. Pumblesnook fixed a dramatic stare upon the child. "What is your name, boy?" he demanded. "Please, sir," said Eddie. "It's Eddie Dickens." At that moment, Madame Maud marched into the stable and over to Eddie's trunk, and guttering candle clasped in her hand. She lifted the lid, and ignoring the fact that the trunk was obviously empty, shouted, "Not asleep yet?" Without waiting for the reply that she wouldn't have received anyway, she dropped the lid with a thunk, and then marched back out of the stable and into the night. "Ooh, such a charming lady, husband Doust," sighed Miss Pumblesnook, looking after Eddie's great-aunt as though she were the beloved queen herself. "Such a refinement and such breeding." "Indeed," agreed her husband. He turned back to Eddie. "You're related to Miss Dickens, I presume?" Eddie nodded. "For those readers who are concerned that we shall be lumbered with these oh-so-amusing theatricals for at least the remainder of the episode, fear not. Fate would have it that a carelessly dropped match was soon to set fire to the surrounding hay and to the clothing of a number of the less important strolling theatricals. Had this actually occurred during one of the performances, the show would have had to continue right through to the end, no matter the cost to human life. One of the rules that such people lived by was that the show must go on. This, however, was only a rehearsal, so instead of old Wiggins and even older Postwaite being burnt to a crisp, they fled into the courtyard of the coaching inn, where the fellow theatricals beat out the flames with their jackets, then proceeded to dunk them in the horse's drinking trough. In the meantime, and in the stable, Miss Pumblesnook picked at her facial blotches, and her husband practiced rolling his eyes in a manner befitting a gentleman for his upcoming leading role in An Egg for Breakfast. Eddie had been quite forgotten in the excitement. With a sigh, he climbed back into his trunk, closing the lid behind him. There he remained until daybreak. Chapter 4. On the Road Again. In which Aunt Maud is even more maddening than usual. The journey to Awful End began bright and early next morning. Mad Uncle Jack and equally mad Aunt Maud had breakfasted on deviled kidneys, 6 eggs, a joint of ham, and several glasses of port wine, served up by a jovial Mr. Loaf. Eddie had breakfasted on the lid of his trunk. He had had a slice of stale bread and some moldy cheese. When Miss Loaf had first appeared at the stable with this food, the slice of bread had been fresh, still warm from the oven. She had baked it, and there hadn't been so much as a smidgen of mold on the generous slice of cheese. When Mr. Loaf realized this, she apologized most profusely, which means rather a lot, in the kind of language Mr. Pumblesnook liked to use, and hurried back into the kitchen. She returned with the stale bread and moldy cheese, and apologized once more. "Do forgive me, Mr. Edmund," she said. "I don't know what I was thinking. I can't have you go spreading stories about us treating our guests kindly, now can I? The more people could come to stay, and I'd never get a moment's peace." "I'm sorry," said Eddie. He wasn't sure he understood. "How would you like strangers sleeping in your house, and the moment one lot leaves, another lot turns up?" she demanded. "But surely that's what coaching-inns are for," began Eddie, only to be interrupted. "It's all right for Mr. Loaf. He doesn't have to do all that sheet-changing and washing and ironing. Oh, no, all he has to do is drink ale out of a pewter tankard at the bar and shout, 'Time, gentlemen, please.' That's all he has to do. Then why do you work in and so I don't want you feeling welcome, now do I?" she said, thrusting the stale and moldy replacement breakfast onto the lid of the trunk. "Eat this and be grateful." Hetty Dickens noticed that the plate had a large crack in it, clogged up with at least 6 months' worth of grime. This woman certainly knew how to make a meal unappetizing when she put her mind to it. "Thank you," mumbled Eddie, more confused than ever. If it was possible, and despite breakfast, mad Uncle Jack looked even thinner than he had the previous day. He helped his wife and her stuffed stoat into the coach and shut the door behind Eddie, then clambered up into the driving seat. Mr. Loaf led the horse out of the main entrance to the coaching inn and hitched him up to the carriage. "Thank you, my good man," cried mad Uncle Jack, reaching into the pocket of his coat and pulling out a dried eel which he tossed down to the grateful landlord. "No, thank you, sir," said Mr. Loaf, and winked at Eddie Dickens, who was leaning out of the carriage window and watching the proceedings. Eddie imagined Mr. Loaf parceling up the eel, along with the other dried fish his great-uncle had used to pay for the board and lodgings, and sending them on to his father. "Goodbye, Master Edmund," beamed the landlord. "Good luck." "Good riddance," added Miss Loaf sweetly, with a flick of the reins and a loud whinny from Eddie's great-uncle, not the horse, which was still far too sleepy to be making conversation at that time of the morning. They were off. Mr. and Miss Loaf ran alongside the carriage, shouting and waving at Eddie. "Drop us a line, Master Edmund," called the landlord. "Drop dead," called the landlady. "Stay again soon," cried the landlord. "Stay away," cried the landlady. "If you're ever passing this way," began the landlord. "Keep going without stopping," finished the landlady. And so the comments continued until the carriage picked up speed and the Loafs were left behind them. Eddie had to admit Miss Loaf really did have an excellent knack of making him feel unwelcome. He never wanted to go to the coaching inn again. "What time is it?" demanded Mad Aunt Maud. She was looking directly at Eddie when she asked the question, so he decided that she really must be asking him and not the stuffed stoat. "I'm afraid I don't have a watch," said Eddie. "Then borrow mine." His great-aunt rummaged in a small patchwork sack she had on the seat next to her. She pulled out a silver pocket watch on a chain and handed it to him. "Now what time is it?" He read the hands. "It's 3 minutes after 8 o'clock," he said, passing the watch back to her. She studied the timepiece in her gnarled hands. "I couldn't accept this," she said. "It's solid silver." She held the watch up to her right ear and listened. "And it has a very expensive tick. No, I most certainly couldn't accept such a valuable gift from a mere child. But it's yours," Eddie tried to point out. "No, I cannot accept it," insisted Mad Aunt Maud sternly. "We'll hear no more about it. What would your poor crinkly-edged mother have to say about you trying to give away your treasured watch?" Eddie sighed, but decided it was best not to try and argue with his great-aunt. He slipped the watch into his pocket. "Thief!" cried Maud. "Thief!" She brandished Malcolm, the stuffed stoat, by the tail like a club. It was as stiff as a policeman's truncheon and made a frightening weapon. "Return my property to me at once," she demanded. Eddie swallowed hard. He dug his hand back into his pocket and passed her back her watch. Great-Aunt Maud grinned from ear to ear. "What a charming present," she said. "How thoughtful, how sweet. Putting down Malcolm carefully on the seat next to her, she leaned to her left and opened the window of the carriage, then tossed out the silver fob watch. "Useless trinket," she mumbled. There was a cry followed by a bit of confusion, and then the carriage lurched to a halt. Eddie was propelled out of his seat to his horror, landed headfirst in his great-aunt's lap. Apologizing, he got to his feet and caught sight of a bearded stranger through the open window of the carriage. The bearded stranger was rubbing his head with one hand and holding Aunt Maud's watch with the other. Mad Uncle Jack had jumped down off the now stationary carriage and was striding toward the man. "Why did you cry out like that?" demanded Eddie's great-uncle. "You frightened my horse." "Because one of your number assailed me with a projectile," sputtered the bearded stranger, barely able to contain his rage. "Who did what with a what?" demanded Uncle Jack. "A member of your party assaulted me with a missile," the bearded stranger explained. When it was obvious that Uncle Jack still had no idea what he was talking about, he tried again. "One of your lot threw this pocket watch at me," he said. "How very interesting," said Mad Uncle Jack. Before the bearded stranger knew what was happening, Eddie's great-uncle had snatched the watch from his grasp and was studying it closely. "This watch does indeed belong to my beloved wife Maud," he mused. "I gave it to her on the occasion of her 21st birthday. Here, read the inscription." He thrust the watch under the bearded stranger's chin, and the bearded stranger managed to distinguish the silver watch chain from his beard. He read the inscription. Okay, never mind. Anyway, to Maud, happy 22nd birthday. Oh, sorry, it doesn't say 20. Okay. Happy 2nd birthday, Jack. The bearded stranger frowned. "Didn't you just say that you gave this to your wife for her 21st birthday?" he asked. "What of it?" demanded Mad Uncle Jack, digging his hands into the pockets of his coat and clasping a dried fish in each. "Simply that the engraving refers to her 2nd birthday, not her 21st. Uncle Jack snorted at the bearded stranger as if he was an idiot. "It was cheaper to have 2nd engraved rather than 21, he explained. "You had to pay by the letter." "But the 21 is a number, not a letter," the bearded stranger pointed out. "Then I was overcharged," muttered Mad Uncle Jack. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention, sir. After we have deposited my great-nephew at Awful End, I will visit the shop where I originally bought this watch for my dear Maud some 55 years ago, and demand my refund of a halfpenny." "Yes, that's all very well, but that still doesn't explain the reason why I became the target of a watch-thrower," the bearded stranger protested. Mad Uncle Jack stuck his head in through the open window of the carriage, his beak-like nose narrowly avoiding poking Eddie's eye out. "Maud, dearest," he inquired. "Yes, Peach Blossom," she replied. "Did you throw your watch at this gentleman?" "Gentleman? Gentleman?" she fumed. "He's nothing more than a beard on legs." "Did you?" "I wasn't aiming at him," said Maud. "He simply got in the way." "That's solved then," said Mad Uncle Jack, satisfied that the truth had been reached. "My wife was not throwing things at you, sir. She was simply throwing things, and your head was in the way." With that, Mad Uncle Jack went to climb back up into the driver's seat on the top of the carriage. The bearded stranger put his arm on Mad Uncle Jack's shoulder. "Not so fast," he said. "This is a public highway, and I have every right to be walking down it unmolested." Mad Uncle Jack pulled free of his grasp and clambered up the side of the carriage. "Your head was in the way, sir," he said. He liked the phrase, so he repeated it. "Your head was in the way." "Then be very careful that this boy's head does not get in the way of one of my bullets," said the bearded stranger. He opened his coat and pulled out a revolver. He pointed it through the open carriage window and aimed it straight between Eddie's eyes. Episode 5, Big Guns, in which we learn that a bearded stranger isn't either. Now I know if you've ever had a revolver pointed at you, but even if you haven't, you probably know what one looks like. First and foremost, it's a gun. You pull the trigger, and if someone's remembered to put the bullets in it, one whizzes out of the end of the barrel and buries itself deep as possible in the target. If the target is just that, a target, then it makes an impressive bang followed by a twang, and everyone hurries forward to see how close the bullet hole is to the bullseye. If the target is a person, there is normally a cry of "Arg!" as well as the bang followed by a thud as the person falls to the ground with what looks like spaghetti sauce splattered all over his shirt, which isn't very nice, especially if your job is to wash the shirt afterward. In case you haven't guessed it, guns aren't the safest of inventions. The important thing about a revolver is how the weapon got its name. It has a revolving chamber. This means that once a bullet has been fired, the chamber revolves so the next bullet is lined up with the barrel and ready to go. This is jolly useful if you plan to rob a bank or something and want to fire lots of bullets into the ceiling and make people lie on the floor and be ever so helpful. It's amazing how happy even the most unfriendly bank manager is to open the safe when he has ceiling plaster in his hair. Fortunately, revolvers are also jolly useful for sheriffs and marshals and people like that. They track down bank robbers and lock them away for a very long time for shooting innocent ceilings that never did anyone any harm in the first place. Anyway, Eddie Dickens' day, revolvers were one of the newest of inventions. Before the revolver came along, most guns were flintlock pistols. They didn't even have proper bullets. You filled the barrel with gunpowder, added small metal pellets called shot, and hoped for the best. One of the problems with a flintlock was that you had to reload it every time you'd fired it. This took about the length of time it took for a person you were firing at to come over to you and hit you over the head with the branch of a tree or whatever else he or she could lay his or her hands on. An even bigger problem was that a flintlock wasn't very reliable. If people weren't very reliable, that isn't always the end of the world. They say that they'll meet you on the outside of the cinema at 3 o'clock, then turn out at 1:30. The film's already started. It's annoying, but you'll live to see another day. If flintlocks are unreliable, you might not get to the living to see another day part. Sometimes you might pull the trigger off of a flintlock, and instead of the gunpowder firing the shot out of the barrel at the enemy, it would decide to blow up instead. Bang, just like that. If you were lucky, it would mean that friends would only have to buy you one glove for Christmas instead of a pair. If you were unlucky, it would mean that you'd never have to bother to buy a hat again because you wouldn't have the head to put it on. So that's why people who liked weapons thought revolvers were such a good idea. The person you were pointing at the thing at was usually the one who got hurt if the trigger got pulled, which is why Eddie Dickens was feeling very, very nervous. "I think you owe me an apology, sir," said the bearded stranger. "A simple sorry will be enough. Is it too much to ask for?" "Sorry," said Eddie, and he wasn't just being polite, he truly was sorry. Sorry that he'd ever laid eyes on Mad Uncle Jack and Mad Aunt Maud and her stuffed stoat Malcolm. Sorry that he'd ever had to leave home to go on this dreadful journey to Awful End. Who on earth would call their house Awful End anyway? His great-uncle and great-aunt, that's who. And why didn't that surprise Eddie? "Very sorry," Eddie added. "It's not you who should be apologizing, boy," said the bearded stranger. "It's this gentleman here who has insulted me." Eddie was tempted to ask the man why, if he, Eddie, had done nothing wrong. He was the one having the revolver pointed at him, but he thought it best to keep his mouth shut. "Put that thing away, you big bush," snarled Mad Aunt Maud, clambering out of the coach with a surprising speed. She snatched the stranger's beard, and to everyone's complete and utter amazement, and came away in her hand. Only Malcolm the Stoat's expression remained unchanged, which, if you think about it, is hardly surprising. The bearded stranger, who wasn't really bearded at all, made a grab to keep his disguise over his face. As he did so, the revolver was no longer pointing at Eddie, but skyward. Mad Aunt Maud, who obviously wasn't so mad when it came to dealing with would-be highwaymen, grabbed the stuffed stoat by the tail and swung its head against the man's legs. There was a nasty scrunching noise as the stuffed animal's nose came in contact with the man's knees, followed by a loud wail that Eddie was to remember right up until his 16th birthday. How he came to forget the wail on that particular day has to do with a lady hypnotist called the Great Gretchen, and is another story. The non-bearded stranger pitched forward, dropping both his revolver and his false facial hair to the ground. As the gun hit the solid roadway, the trigger was knocked back, and the small flag on the pole shot out of the end of the barrel and stayed there. The flag unfurled, and on it was one word. If you thought that word was bang, then you'd be wrong. The word was pummelsnooks. So you can guess how little the letters had to be for all of them to fit on a flag small enough to fit in the barrel of a gun. But they were big enough for Eddie to read them from where he was standing. The man with the pretend beard had been threatening them with a pretend revolver. Now that the beard was gone and he was rolling around in the mud, clutching his knees, Eddie recognized the insulted stranger instantly. He was no stranger at all. He was none other than Mr. Pumblesnook, the actor-manager of the band of strolling theatricals. It soon became apparent to Eddie that his great-uncle and great-aunt also recognized Mr. Pumblesnook, but instead of being outraged, their behavior amazed Eddie for the zillionth time since he'd left home with them. "Oh, Mr. Pumblesnook, you really are the most remarkable of men," cackled Mad Maud, hoisting the mud-covered man to his feet with such force that he almost slammed into the side of the coach. Uncle Jack, meanwhile, was bending down and retrieving the fake revolver from the road. "You must certainly have me fooled, sir," he confessed. "I was already wondering how we should divide Eddie's belongings between us if you had shot him." He handed the actor-manager his false beard, which now had a few twigs and a piece of an owl's eggshell in it. "Where are you headed, Mr. Pumblesnook? Might we offer you a lift?" Eddie was furious. He was fuming with rage. Was he the only one who was outraged at some practical joker having pointed a gun at him? It didn't matter that the gun had turned out to be nothing more than a stage prop. The fear Eddie had felt had been real enough. "What's this all about?" he demanded. "Why is Mr. Pumblesnook going about in disguise, frightening poor innocent children like me?" "A disguise, my boy," said Mr. Pumblesnook, one eyebrow raised in a most dramatic manner, as far as eyebrows can be dramatic, that is. "Criminals wear disguises, my child. Spies wear disguises. This is not a disguise, Mr. Edmund. This is a costume. This is me in character. But you're not on stage now," Eddie protested, quickly adding a "sir." Now, actors love to quote the lines of a playwright called Shakespeare, not just when they're in the middle of a Shakespeare play on stage, but whenever they get the chance. One of Shakespeare's lines that actors most like to quote is, "All the world's a stage." You may not think that it's the most brilliant line in the world, and that you could have come up with it, but Shakespeare came up with it first, and that's the main thing. Who remembers the name of the second human being to set foot on the moon? Who remembers who came second in last Wednesday's geography test? Who remembers there was even a test? No, Shakespeare was the first one to write these words down, and because they're about acting, these are words actors particularly like to quote. Think back to Eddie's words just then, and you can imagine how delighted Mr. Pumblesnook must have been that he'd just heard them. For those of you too lazy to look to the top of the page, let me remind you that Eddie said, "But you're not on the stage now, sir." No wonder Mr. Pumblesnook's eyes lit up. Eddie's comment gave him the perfect opportunity to reply, "But in the words of the immortal bard, all the world's a stage, my dear boy." And Eddie was impressed. He had no idea who or what the immortal bard was. He had no way of knowing that it was strolling theatrical speak for Shakespeare, but he was impressed by a pertinent quote that he heard one. "It is important for a great actor to get in character," Mr. Pumblesnook explained. "It is important to develop a role long before it reaches an audience." "Then why, when I was preparing for the part of the salmon and wee little fishes, I spent a whole month in the bath and ate nothing but lugworm and ants' eggs?" He climbed up to the coach and sat next to Madame Maud, who was back in her original seat. Malcolm was back on her lap, none the worse for wear. "I remember that time when you were preparing to play the part of the kidnapper and bound hand and foot," she said, the admiration sounding in her voice. "The way you managed to trick the genuine French ambassador down into your cellar and kept him hostage there was a stroke of genius. Such a shame you were arrested before the show could be performed." "Theater's lost," the actor-manager agreed, shaking his head sadly. Eddie sat down and closed the door to the coach. He had a terrible sinking feeling Mr. Pumblesnook was obviously a close friend of his great-aunt and great-uncle, and that strongly suggested he was as mad as they were. Episode 6, Orphanage, in which geese save Rome. Yeah, it's not clear. Okay. Every story is told from a certain point of view. The storyteller, who is me in this instance, tells a story in a certain way and sticks to it. Apart from the occasional trip to Mr. and Miss Dickens' bathroom, the story has been told from the point of view of staying with poor young Eddie. Wherever he goes, we go. When he got into the carriage, we went with him. When he spent the night in the stable of the coaching inn, we spent the night there too. When he was staring down the barrel of a fake revolver, we didn't run off and leave him there. But let's not be too proud of ourselves for standing our ground. If the revolver had been the genuine article and a bullet had been fired, Eddie would have been the one who was shot and bleeding, not us. I might be able to invent a book that fires a bullet at its readers when they turn to page 42, but imagine the mess it might cause in bookshops or public libraries. No, the important thing is that nowhere in the story have I said meanwhile and switched the action away from Eddie to somewhere else. It's perfectly okay to do that in a book. There's nothing wrong with it. There's some really good stories where the author says meanwhile and switches the action to somewhere else. But what a good storyteller doesn't do is suddenly change the point of view. After all this time of not saying meanwhile and switching the action to somewhere else, he doesn't suddenly say meanwhile and switch the action to somewhere else. Meanwhile, back at Eddie's home, his parents were in a state of panic. The reason why the Dickenses were panicking was the small matter of their house being on fire. Nothing could spoil a late afternoon as much as having flames leaping out of the upstairs windows, licking at the woodwork. This was a direct result of the latest stage in Dr. Muffin's treatment for the terrible ailment, even hotter hot water bottles. The Dickensons were only allowed to get up 3 times a day. They had to suck special ice cubes, and they had to snuggle up in bed with piles of hot water bottles. When this had failed to achieve the desired results, the good doctor decided that their hot water bottles couldn't have been hot enough. He solved this by devising a new system especially for them. This system would heat the hot water bottles while they were actually in the bed with the patients. And Mr. and Miss Dickens were the very first people he tried it out on. As it turned out, they were to be the only people he tried the system out on, because he guessed correctly that setting fire to those in his care wasn't particularly good for building a bond between any doctor and his patients. I say his patients rather than his or her patients because there weren't any women doctors in those days. They weren't allowed. It was something to do with the belief by the medical experts with Huge Beards Association that women's hair would somehow get in the way of their stethoscopes when trying to listen to heartbeats. It was a pretty feeble excuse, but the governing body of the medical experts with Huge Beards Association really did have very impressive beards, so no one dared argue with them. Anyway, back to Dr. Muffin and his hot water bottle heating system. At his home, the doctor had a special tray on the sideboard of his dining room designed to keep food hot. Under the tray were 3 liquid paraffin burners with adjustable wicks to make the flames bigger or smaller. He took these burners to the Dickens's house and put them under the bed. The idea was that the flames would gently heat the mattress, which in turn would gently heat the hot water bottles, which would in turn gently heat Eddie's parents. That was the idea. Of course, when the doctor did his first test run on the bed in Eddie's room, because he was on the way to awful end and wouldn't be needing it, Eddie's mattress burst into flames. Fortunately for the doctor, he was holding a hot water bottle, from which he whipped the stopper and poured the contents onto the mattress and extinguished the conflagration, which is a 28-letter way of saying what "put the flames out" says in 15. Eddie's parents could smell the burning but couldn't investigate because they'd already been up 3 times that day, once to have a sword fight with the Thackeray's over the Grange, once to go shark fishing with the Trollope family, who were renting a houseboat on a nearby lake, and once to throw an old boot at a cat that was yelling at the top of its compost heap. So they knew they must stay in bed. Dr. Muffin would be very angry with them if they got up to a 4th time, and might refuse to allow them to pay him lots of money to treat them any more. "Ish everything all right?" called out Miss Dickens, who on this occasion didn't have a famous general-shaped ice cube or an onion in her mouth, or both for that matter. The reason why "is everything all right" came out sounding so strange on this occasion was that she had Mr. Dickens' ear in her mouth. Those of you with a squeamish nature who feel sick if they tear a fingernail or see an ant walking with a slight limp will be pleased to know that the ear was still attached to the side of Mr. Dickens' head, which was exactly where it should be. It was simply that Miss Dickens had been sleeping moments before the goose in their bedroom smelled the smoke coming from their son's room and woke them up with its loud honking. Geese were very popular in the days before battery-powered smoke alarms. If you think that sounds crazy, go find a teacher or some other kind of know-it-all and ask the following 2 questions. 1. Are a flock of geese really supposed to have raised the alarm and warned the ancient Romans of an attack on the Capitoline Hill by the Gauls in 387 BC? 2. Did miners really used to take canaries down to the mines to warn them of any gas in the mine shafts? The answer to both of those questions should be a resounding yes. So the Dickens family's goose smoke alarm wasn't such a crazy idea after all, now was it? In fact, the very first battery-powered smoke detector alarm was a bird, though in fact it was a chicken, not a goose. Surely you've heard of a battery hens? So where was I? Oh yes, the smoke from Eddie's burning mattress made the goose honk, which then woke up Miss Dickens. She had been dreaming that she was eating a dried prune, which she discovered upon waking was in fact her husband's ear. She called out to ask Dr. Muffin if everything was all right, and lying, he assured her it was. The doctor then refined the method. He realized that what stopped the flames of the 3 paraffin burners from burning his food and the sideboard at home was that they heated the metal tray, which in turn heated serving dishes, which in turn heated the food. So what he did was turn Eddie's parents out of bed and make them sit on one of the 31 different types of chair designed to make you sit up straight even if your wrists were handcuffed to your ankles. There had been 32 when Eddie left the house, but one had been completely eaten by a hungry woodworm since then. It must have been very hungry indeed, because Eddie had only gone one night. While the Dickenses shared a chair, Dr. Muffin rolled back the mattress and placed a number of trays and serving dishes he'd found down in the kitchen on the bed springs. He then rolled the mattress back into place with a satisfying crunch of china. He placed the 3 paraffin burners on the floor under the bed, made the wicks as big as possible, lit them, and then ordered his 2 yellow and crinkly-edged patients back into bed. That should keep you good and warm, he announced. You must both stay here until morning. Under no circumstances must you get up unless it is to go to the bathroom. Good day to you. With that, he left the bedroom, walked past Eddie's room, where the blackened mattress still smoldered, and made his way downstairs and out of the house. Not 10 minutes later, the Dickens's mattress was on fire. Perhaps it's supposed to be, said Miss Dickens, a trifle concerned. Surely not, said Mr. Dickens, the left leg of whose pajamas had just caught alight. What shall we do? Asked Miss Dickens, the pom-pom on the end of her nightcap glowing like a golden Christmas tree bauble. Do? Why, nothing, said Mr. Dickens. The doctor has forbidden us to get up under any circumstances he could brought up to respect the orders of a medical man. Under no circumstances, unless it is to go to the bathroom, said Miss Dickens, reminding her husband. Then let's go to the bathroom, cried Mr. Dickens. Good idea, said Miss Dickens, and they both leapt out of bed seconds before all paper bedclothes went up in a very pretty whoosh of orange flame. By the time they reached the bathroom, because they thought it would be cheating if they didn't really go there, it was on fire too. So were the stairs, their bedroom, Eddie's bedroom, the roof, and just about everything else upstairs. Oh dear, said Miss Dickens, what shall we do? Okay, I think you can see it. They decided to panic, which made perfect sense under the circumstances, because there wasn't a lot else they could do. The goose, meanwhile, had flown out of the window and was honking to her heart's content. Thinking of meanwhile, as I was earlier. If you recall, Eddie, meanwhile, was sitting on the edge of a metal-framed bed in a dark cell of a huge prison-like building called St. Hard's Home for Grateful Orphans. Words his wise old mother had spoken came back to him. There was something she'd uttered before he'd set off with Mad Uncle Jack. Do be careful to make sure that you're not mistaken for a runaway orphan and taken to the orphanage, where you'll then suffer cruelty, hardship, and misery, she'd said. And now here Eddie was. What's really annoying is that we don't know how he got here. We were so busy with our meanwhile back at the home with his parents that we missed the main action. Perhaps we'll never find out how he ended up in this godforsaken place. Perhaps we'll find out in the next episode. In the meantime, we must leave Eddie frightened and alone in his cell, while his parents trapped upstairs in a burning building. Sometimes life can be really tough. Episode 7, Escape, in which we finally get back to poor old Eddie. "Oh dear, Mr. Dickens," cried Miss Dickens. "Whatever shall we do now?" "Do, Miss Dickens," said her husband. "Why, we shall burn to death, of course." "Do you think that was Dr. Muffin's intention?" asked Miss Dickens, beating out the row of orange flames that were licking at the bottom of her nightgown. "Well, being burnt to a crisp would most certainly cure us of our dreadful illness," Eddie's father pointed out. Anyone eavesdropping on this conversation would never have guessed that these were the same two people who moments before had been out of the terrible state of panic. Anyone eavesdropping on the conversation would also have been very hot. The reason why Eddie's parents were suddenly so calm was that they were in the bathroom, and the bathroom contained a cabinet that contained a bottle that contained Dr. Muffin's patent anti-panic pills. Mr. and Miss Dickens had both eaten a fistful. The reason why anyone eavesdropping would also have been very hot was the bathroom was now a wall of flame. The Dickens's alarm goose, meanwhile, had flown to the nearest house, the Grange, owned by the Thackeray family, and was busy telling their alarm goose what had happened. Here follows a rough translation of the conversation between two birds. Thackeray goose: "You smell of smoke, Myrtle." Dickens goose: "Hardly surprising, Agnes. The Dickens residence has gone up in flames." Thackeray goose: "Oh dear." Dickens goose: "Yes, such a shame." Unfortunately, all the Thackeray's daughter, who was sitting near the geese at the time, heard was Thackeray goose: "Honk, honk, 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 honk." Dickens goose: "Honk, honk, 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 honk." Thackeray goose: "Honk, honk." Dickens goose: "Honk, honk, honk, honk." Even if she had understood every word the two geese had spoken, this still wouldn't have been much use to the poor old Dickensons trapped in their burning home. Charlotte Thackeray was less than a year old, and although she made a wide selection of exciting noises, from goo to ga and guck thrown in for good measure, her doting parents couldn't understand a single word she said. Fortunately for Eddie's parents, however, help was at hand. Those of you who can remember all the way back to page 6 will recall that the cupboard under the stairs of the Dickens household was occupied by Gibbering Jane. Gibbering Jane was a chambermaid who had failed the 8-week bed-making course and lived a life of shame in the darkness. She never came out of her understairs hideaway. Food was slipped through the crack between the floor and the bottom of the door, and if you really want to know how she washed and went to loo, I'll have to draw you a very detailed and complicated diagram, which will cost you a great deal of money. The only other person in the house, apart from Eddie's parents of course, was Dawkins, Mr. Dickens' gentleman's gentleman, who lived in a basket with plenty of tissue paper in the kitchen. He's also been mentioned before, but I can't remember the page he first put in an appearance. I do remember that the Dickensons often didn't remember Dawkins' name and sometimes called him Daphne, though. One of Dawkins' duties was to feed Gibbering Jane. He was just passing through the hallway, making his way toward the cupboard under the stairs, when he noticed that the whole of the upstairs of the house was on fire. Without a moment's thought for his own personal safety, Dawkins knew exactly what he must do. He dashed back into the kitchen and rescued his tissue paper from his basket. He snatched the paper up in his arms and then ran outside with it, leaving it beside a tree, weighed down with half a brick. Satisfied that this was a job well done, he decided that he'd better go back inside and see if Gibbering Jane or his master and mistress needed any help. "Help!" cried Mr. Dickens from upstairs. "Help!" cried Miss Dickens from upstairs. "Are you talking to me?" Dawkins shouted. "Who all y'all talking to, Dawkins?" asked Miss Dickens, who had just stuffed another fistful of Dr. Muffin's patent anti-panic pills into her mouth. Dawkins was well used to his mistress talking with her mouth full, and instantly translated this latest communication to mean, "Who are you talking to, Dawkins?" "Why, to both of you and the master," he shouted, and then coughed as a cloud of smoke billowed down stairwell. "Well, we were indeed calling for help from anyone who might hear us, and that most certainly includes you, Daphne," cried Mr. Dickens. "Unless you can help us sooner rather than later, my wife and I are sure to end up dead before the end of the episode 7. "Before the end of what, sir?" shouted the gentleman's gentleman, who had no idea that he was a character in a story. "Never mind, Dawkins," yelped Eddie Dickens' mother. who, as you can tell from her voice, had now swallowed her pills. "Just rescue us, will you?" Dawkins thought this was an excellent idea. If only he could think how to rescue them. He heard some gibbering at the ankle height and looked down to see gibbering Jane. It wasn't that she was so small that she only came up to his ankles. That would be ridiculous. It's just that, apart from Eddie, she was about the most sensible person we've run into in this adventure. She knew that hot air, which includes smoke, rises. So the best thing to do, if you don't want to suffocate, is lie on the floor with a wet flannel over your face. Gibbering Jane was lying on the floor, and she didn't have a flannel, so she was using a knitted flatter. In all the years Jane had been in the cupboard under the Dickinsons' stairs, she spent at least 11 hours and 36 minutes a day knitting. To begin with, she made all the usual things: scarves, tea cozies, bobble hats, but over time she'd become more adventurous, knitting everything from fireplaces to ladders. Dawkins saw the knitted ladder, and without so much as a "May I borrow this for a moment?" he snatched it from Gibbering Jane's grasp. This wasn't the sort of ladder Dawkins could climb up to rescue the Dickinsons. It was all floppy and would need to be fixed in position upstairs in the first place. But if he could somehow get the knitted ladder up to them, Mr. and Miss Dickens could then tie it to something heavy, throw the other end out of the window, and clamber down. "I have a plan," Dawkins shouted. "This is no time to be frying eggs," cried Miss Dickens. "What plan?" shouted Miss Dickens. Oh, sorry. It was Mr. Dickens the first time, whose eyebrows had just been singed off by a passing fireball. Unfortunately, Dawkins had misheard his mistress's response to mishearing him. He thought she said, "This is now time to be frying eggs," so being a very obedient servant who never questioned the Dickens's instructions, he'd already rushed to the kitchen to prepare them a mouth-watering, eggy snack instead of putting his rescue operation into effect. Gibbering Jane, in the meantime, was gibbering, which should come as no surprise, and also crawling across the floor to safety. Parts of the upstairs of the house were now joining the downstairs by the quickest route, which was by falling from a great height in burning chunks. Unless either Mr. or Miss Dickens could come up with a good plan and put it into operation within the next 8 paragraphs, there was no way they'd come out of this alive, and that way Eddie would rightfully be in St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans rather than because of some dreadful mistake. It was then that Miss Dickens had a brainwave. She usually had one every 16 years or so, and wasn't due to have one for another 3. Luckily for them, though, she had this one early. "The winch!" she cried. "The what?" "Follow me," Eddie's mom shouted, and dashed back onto the landing, the fire raging all around her. Mr. Dickens followed her into the bedroom. There in the corner was a coil of sheets. These were the same sheets that had been tied together and used to lower the bed out of the window when they were waving farewell to dear Eddie and Nautical Jack and Aunt Maud. The reason why the sheets hadn't burnt to a crisp, like almost everything around them, was that they were soaking wet. It had been raining hard when Eddie's parents had seen his carriage disappearing into the distance. By the time Dawkins had winched the master and mistress back into the room and given them fresh brown paper sheets, the soaking wet coil of knotted sheets had been used to hoist them up and down lay forgotten in the corner. The heat of the fire had almost dried the sheets by now, and there was a hiss of the water turning into steam above them, but they were still just too wet to burn. Miss Dickens grabbed the sheets and tied one end to the nearest heavy thing that wasn't on fire. Unfortunately for Mr. Dickens, that was him, and he had to struggle to free himself. He retied the sheets to the metal frame, which was all that remained of their bed. The frame was very hot, and they burnt his fingers, but there was no time to lose. Meanwhile, Miss Dickens had thrown the other end of the knotted sheets out of the window. "Go," said her husband urgently, and she clambered down the outside of the house to safety. Now it was Eddie's father's turn. He had always been afraid of heights, and even felt a bit dizzy when he stood on tiptoe. Once, when he had stood on a chair to reach a book on a high shelf, he had to be talked down by a team of passing philosophers brought in by the fire brigade. One of the few things Mr. Dickens was more afraid of than heights, though, was fire, so he was out of the window and climbing down outside the house quicker than you could say, "How now, brown cow," which I've always thought was a rather strange thing for anybody to want to say anyway. The result was that both Mr. and Miss Dickens escaped from the fire that had been caused as a direct result of Dr. Muffin's treatment. Unfortunately for Dawkins, sometimes known as Daphne, he wasn't so lucky. After trying to reach his master and mistress with the eggy snack they had made as a result of a genuine misunderstanding, he was forced back by the flames and had to retire to the garden. There he discovered that a burning ember must have floated through the air and landed on his tissue paper, setting it alight and reducing it to a very small pile of ashes. He burst into tears at this unhappy sight. Gibbering Jane was equally unlucky. The results of all her years of knitting 11 hours and 36 minutes each and every day were destroyed, except for the top left-hand corner of an egg cozy, which she was to wear on a string around her neck for the rest of her life. "We're alive," said Miss Dickens. "Thanks to your plan, my dearest," said Mr. Dickens. "But no thanks to Dr. Muffin," said Miss Dickens, beginning to have doubts about the doctor for the very first time since the treatment had started. Eddie's father was about to agree with Eddie's mother when he noticed that there was something different about her. At first he thought it must be the black soot that was smeared all over her face, but after he had rubbed it off her with the damp sheet that flapped at the bottom of the rope, he realized what it was. "You're not yellow anymore," he gasped. Miss Dickens grabbed the sides of Mr. Dickens' head and felt them. "And you're not crinkly around the edges anymore," she said in amazement. Then they sniffed the air. It smelled of burning house and furniture. "And we don't smell of old hot water bottles," they cried in unison. "We're cured," said Mr. Dickens, and taking his wife by the hand, he danced around with her in a little circle. "Dr. Muffin is such a genius," Miss Dickens pronounced. "I'm so sorry I doubted him." And that moment there was a terrible groan, and their home came crashing down into a pile of brick and wood that looked nothing more than a giant bonfire. "This calls for a celebration," said Miss Dickens. "Just think, now that we're cured, there's no need for Simon to stay at Awful End." "You mean Jonathan," said her husband, and when in fact they both meant Eddie. You'll recall that neither of them was terribly good at remembering their son's name. "We'll send word to Mad Uncle Jack to bring him back home," smiled Miss Dickens. Little did she and Mr. Dickens know that their dear beloved son had never even reached Awful End, but was languishing in St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. Now, you don't really know what languishing means, and I don't really know what languishing means, but it's what people do in prison cells or orphanages in books, and this is a book, and poor old Eddie is in an orphanage, so language he must, and that, I'm afraid, is the way of the world. There was a book in Eddie's room, in the orphanage, written on the front in big golden letters, with the 3 words, "The Good and Book," which, if you put them together, says "Book, Good, Thee." If you put them together in the correct order, they say "The Good Book," which is what I should have done in the first place. As it was, this was the book that was going to help Eddie escape, but not until a later episode, and not until we find out how he ended up in St. Horrid's in the first place. Episode 8. Get on with it, in which a chocolate could be a mouse dropping. Things started to go from bad to worse for Eddie after the actor-manager, Mr. Pumblesnook, joined him and Mad Aunt Maud in their carriage, not forgetting Malcolm the stuffed goat. Who could forget Malcolm? Not Eddie, that's for sure, because the stout was stuck in his ear. "Why are we all squashed together like this?" he demanded, still angry with Mr. Pumblesnook for pretending to be a villain and pointing the revolver at him. "Couldn't one of us sit on the other seat?" This seemed fair enough question because all 3 of them, plus Stoat, were sitting next to each other along one seat, while the seat opposite was vacant, which spells empty. "I am in charge of seating arrangements, and I say this is how we shall sit," roared Mad Aunt Maud. "Did you not, in fact, spend a summer at the young ladies' school for seating?" asked Mr. Pumblesnook, who in Eddie's opinion was simply trying to keep her in good books. "You are correct as always, Mr. Pumblesnook," Mad Aunt Maud simpered and blushed like a young schoolgirl, which, with her age and wrinkles, gave her the appearance of an underripe prune. "I did not, in fact, spend a summer at the young ladies' school for seating. My knowledge of seating arrangements is instinctive. I was born with the skill." "But this is ridiculous," said Eddie, who now had the misfortune of his great aunt's elbow in his ribs as well as a Stoat in his ear. "Quiet, boy!" screamed Mad Aunt Maud. When I was a girl, children are seen but not heard. When I was in my early youth, began the actor-manager, who you will recall used many words when few would do. When I was in my early youth, children were neither seen nor heard. Just smelled? Suggested Madame Maud. It was obvious to Eddie that Mr. Pummelsnook hadn't been about to say just smelled, but he was too polite to say so. They were neither seen nor heard, just smelled, Madame Maud screamed. Rubbed down with an onion, so they just smelled. The mention of an onion reminded Eddie of his own dear mother, who had recently taken to popping whole-peeled onions in her mouth to improve the shape of her head. You guessed it, this was another part of Dr. Muffin's treatment, he sighed. Don't be sad, child, said the actor-manager. Let us take advantage of the many miles and hours we share to see whether you have within you the potential to be a thespian. Eddie looked at him blankly. We've got time on our hands to see if you can act, Madame Maud translated. This was the first sensible thing she had done in the brief time he had known her. Eddie was stunned. So was Madame Maud. She seemed as surprised at saying something sensible as Eddie was. Me? Act? Said Eddie, a tingling of excitement starting at his feet. Or perhaps it had more to do with wearing itchy socks. Indeed, boy. That is precisely what I indicated. Let us endeavor to establish whether you have the gift, said Mr. Pummelsnook. As you saw from my performance when hit by this dear lady's watch, he nodded in the direction of Madame Maud, his forehead hitting her on the chin because all three were sitting so close together. It is vital to remain in character, whatever the distraction. Stay in character? Asked Eddie. To be the person whose character you are portraying, explained Mr. Pummelsnook. Eddie still wasn't sure what he meant until Maud explained. Once you're pretending to be in character, don't let anyone put you off. For the second time in as many minutes, Eddie was stunned. If Madame Maud kept on being this helpful, they'd have to rename her Only Mad some of the time, Aunt Maud. What had gotten into her? Acting is so much more than pretending to be a character, stressed the actor-manager, but in essence, once you become the character, you must not, as this fair queen has just intimated, let anyone put you off. Eddie did his best not to laugh at the idea of anyone calling his great-aunt fair queen. At that moment there was a cry of "Whoa there!" from Uncle Jack, and the carriage came to a halt. There was a scrambling sound as he clambered from the driving seat, and then his beakiest of beaky noses appeared through the open carriage window. A call of nature, he said. I didn't hear anything, said Madame Maud. What was it, an owl? No, my dear, what I mean is... Did either of you hear an owl? Asked Madame Maud, turning to Eddie first, an action which led her to hitting him in the face with Malcolm's nose, then turning to Mr. Pummelsnook, hitting him with the stuffed stoat's tail. No, said Eddie, nursing a nosebleed. Neither a terwit nor a terwoo, madame, said Mr. Pummelsnook, looking for the piece of tooth that had been chipped off into his lap. A badger call, then? Asked Madame Maud. Both Mr. Pummelsnook and Eddie tensed just in case she turned to them again, bringing her stoat with her. Who knew what new injuries she might cause? No, my dear, by call of nature I mean that I just have to go to the... I must... Uncle Jack's face reddened. Though it was so thin, you would have thought that there had been no room for it. Not an owl, not a badger? Surely you don't mean the boring little bird that has a call that's supposed to sound like a little bit of a bread and no cheese? Surely you didn't stop the carriage for such a commonplace call as that, his wife protested. Uncle Jack was about to do some more explaining when he could wait no longer and dashed off into the undergrowth. He appeared a few minutes later with a look of relief on his face. Did he find the eagle? Asked Madame Maud, as her husband climbed back into the side of the coach. Eagle? Asked Eddie. Children should neither be seen nor heard, just smelled, she cried in indignation as though she had just thought of it. Eddie relaxed a little. There was something strangely reassuring about his great-aunt going back to being completely bananas. Eagle aside, young fellow, me lad, said Mr. Pummelsnook, let us commence our experiment. There was a flick of the reins, a clomp of the hooves, and the carriage was in motion once more. It was agreed that Eddie was a fine little gentleman. Don't forget that Eddie's parents had spent a good money on turning him into a little gentleman. They tried to spend bad money on him, but it had been sent back. And being such a fine little gentleman, might it not be a good idea to start his acting by playing the part of a child so different from himself? You don't mean a foreigner, said Eddie, shocked. When Mr. Pummelsnook suggested this was in the days when all foreigners were treated with a great deal of distrust, whether they were pincers or paupers or anything else that didn't begin with the letter P. Indeed not, sir, said the actor-manager, clearly shocked. I would hardly ask you, an untrained actor and merely a child, also to assume the role of a foreigner in the presence of a lady in such a confined space. I met a foreigner once, said Madame Maud, a faraway look in her eye. I couldn't see him nor hear him, but I could smell him. Someone had rubbed him down with an onion, Eddie suggested. Good boy, nodded Madame Maud. She tickled him under the chin and slipped a chocolate drop into his mouth. At least Eddie hoped it was a chocolate drop. It certainly looked like one, but knowing his great aunt he had come to, it could have been a mouse dropping. Chewing the thing somewhat nervously, Eddie leaned forward to get a clearer view of the actor-manager past Madame Maud. If not a foreigner, he said, what part would you like me to play? That of an orphan boy, said Mr. Pumblesnook. Those of you with long enough memories, or at least half a brain cell, will see that this really marks the beginning of Eddie's latest troubles. Episode 9, A Serious Misunderstanding, in which we meet the Empress of all China, well, sort of. What is the most important thing to remember when playing a character? Boomed Mr. Pumblesnook, carefully wrapping a piece of one of his teeth in a handkerchief as he spoke. The piece had been broken off when Madame Maud had hit him in the face with a swing of her stoat's tail half a mile or so back. Eddie, meanwhile, was using his handkerchief for a very different reason, to try and stem the flow of blood pouring from his nose. Where his great-aunt had hit him with Malcolm's other end during the self-same swing. Eddie was beginning to suspect that Madame Maud could inflict more damage with that single stuffed animal than the average army could with wheelbarrows full of weapons. The most important thing to remember when playing a character, said Eddie, thinking hard, to stay in that character no matter what. Ridiculous, cackled Madame Maud, then slouched backward in the seat of the carriage. She began rummaging in her handbag. Excellent, said Mr. Pumblesnook. Exactly, my boy, exactly. There was one time when I was playing the character of a large hazelnut for a production of Nuts All Around. The costume was made from genuine hazelnuts by my own good lady wife. Lazy wife? Asked Aunt Maud, perking up. You should poke her with a stick or thrash her to within an inch of her life. An inch is about 2.5 centimeters, but this happened in the old days. And anyway, to thrash someone within 2.5 centimeters of their life doesn't sound so good. My lady wife, Mr. Pumblesnook explained. Now where was I? Oh yes, I was playing the character of a large hazelnut when a family of squirrels, which must have been nesting in the roof of a barn we were using as a theater that night, fell from the hayloft onto our makeshift stage. Eddie wished that the actor-manager would get to the point, but he knew that there was no point in trying to rush a man who used 723 words when 11 would do. And don't go back and count them. That was just a figure of speech. And if you don't know what a figure of speech is, I wouldn't worry too much. I didn't know what a four-wheel drive vehicle was until I knocked down by one when I was 23 years old, and it never did me any harm. Well, it did, in fact, harm me when it ran me over, but you know what I mean. Thinking that I was a giant hazelnut, the squirrels proceeded to attack me and nibbled at my outer shell, Mr. Pumblesnook continued. In such a situation, a mere mortal would have slid out of the costume and fled the arena. But not I. I am an actor. I am a thespian. I was playing the character of a hazelnut in front of an audience, so a hazelnut I had to remain. It would take more than a marauding gang of tree rats. Pirates? Interrupted Aunt Maud. You were attacked by pirates? Not pirates, madame, said Mr. Pumblesnook with extreme patience. Tree rats. Squirrels. Still dabbing his nose with his blood-stained hanky, Eddie was trying to work out why his great-aunt had suddenly started mishearing things. Why had she suddenly gone a bit deaf? She hadn't been much of a problem with her hearing in the first leg of the journey, so why now? So the play continued, Mr. Pumblesnook went on. I remained in costume and in character and behaved as a hazelnut would have behaved when under attack from squirrels. In character, the key to success as an actor, my boy. Eddie was about to ask how the average nut behaved when being eaten by squirrels. In a silent, crunchy sort of way, he supposed. when he was distracted by Mad Aunt Maud's actions. Having a tune so tuneless it could have been illegal to call it a tune in some very strict countries, his great-aunt was trimming her stuffed stoat's nostril hairs with a pair of gold-plated nail scissors. Nothing wrong with that, you might say. There are probably some teachers you can think of who do with shaving their nose hairs or ear hairs, like Miss Boris when I was at school, but it was what Mad Aunt Maud was doing with the trimmed hairs that had caught Eddie's attention. She was storing them in her own ears. All thoughts about nuts had gone out of the window, like his aunt's watch in an earlier episode. No, that's not strictly true. All thoughts of Mr. Pumblesnook dressed as a hazelnut had gone out of the window. Eddie was left thinking about another kind of nut, the nut who was sitting there, with stuffed stoat nostril hair trimmings in her ears, and he was going to have to live with this woman at awful end until his parents were cured. He shuddered. "Are you ready to rise to the challenge, Master Dickens?" asked Mr. Pumblesnook. "Are you prepared to take on the character of an orphan boy and remain in the character in that acting role for the rest of this journey? In fact, are you prepared to take on this character and remain in the character until I tell you otherwise?" "I guess," said Eddie. It might help take his mind off what lay ahead. Life in a strange house with a very strange great-aunt and great-uncle indeed. "Do you promise to remain in character?" demanded Mr. Pumblesnook, leaning across Mad Aunt Mad, who was busy returning the nail scissors into her bag, so momentarily let Malcolm rest on her lap. The actor-manager seized the opportunity of his stuffed stoat-free moment to look Eddie full in the face without the fear of a furry sideswipe of tail, nose, or paw. "Do you promise on your family's honor to stay in character?" "Yes," said Eddie Dickens, meeting Mr. Pumblesnook's gaze. Family honor was much more of a big deal way back then in those days. If you punched a bishop or tickled someone collecting money for charity, it wasn't just you who was disgraced, but your whole family. People would say, that's Miss Harris, whose boy ate that statue made out of lamb chops at the art gallery. And they wouldn't sit next to her at church. Or people would cross the street to avoid walking on the same pavement as any member of the Monroe family just because Mary Monroe had painted the entire Thompson family bright red while they were sleeping next door. No, family honor was important, so to swear on your family's honor was important too. And Eddie Dickens had just sworn on the honor of the Dickens family that he would act as the character of an orphan and keep acting the character of an orphan until Mr. Pumblesnook told him to stop. Now, Einstein wasn't born when the events of this story occurred, but he's dead now that you're reading this. But it's still worth saying that if you don't have to be an Einstein to work out what happened, if you've got a good memory, you'll recall that you were first told that Eddie was going to end up in St. Har's orphanage, for whatever it's called, as long ago as page 50-something, and this is page 78. So it isn't exactly news. Now, though, we actually come to the moment when events headed in that direction. Mad Uncle Jack pulled on the horse's reins and ordered, "Whoa, boy!" The horse, not used to his master's giving sensible instructions, was so surprised that he actually stopped, which was exactly what Mad Uncle Jack had wanted. He had wanted to stop because there was a man with a very tall hat standing in the middle of the road. If Mad Uncle Jack hadn't ordered "Whoa, boy," and the horse hadn't been surprised enough to stop, the man would probably have been wearing a very squat, crumpled hat by now, and would probably have been somewhat squat and crumpled himself. Mad Uncle Jack had wanted to avoid this because even in the flailing light of early evening, you could tell that this man was a peeler. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that a peeler is something you use to take the skin off potatoes, and you'd be right, but this peeler was a different kind of peeler. This peeler was named after a man called Sir Robert Peel, and if you think that this is beginning to sound like a history lesson, then you'd be right again, so I'll keep it short. As well as being famous for being British Prime Minister, Robert Peel also founded his first proper police force in Britain, and the policemen were nicknamed Peelers after him. If his name had been Sir Robert Bonk, then they'd have been nicknamed Bunkers, so they should think themselves lucky. So now you can see why Eddie's great-uncle was reluctant to run this man over with his horse and carriage. It was true then as it is today. Policemen get annoyed if you run them over, especially if you crumple their tall hats. This peeler's hat, like all peelers' hats, was very tall and thin. It was about as tall as 3 top hats, one on top of the other. This isn't a very helpful description if you've never seen a top hat. It's a bit like saying to someone, when your mother sings in the bath, she makes a noise like a greater racket-tailed dongo, when the person you're talking to has never even heard of a greater thingamywatsid dongo, let alone heard the noise it makes. So if you've no idea what a top hat looks like, tough luck. This peeler's hat was still the height of 3 top hats, one on top of the other, whether you've seen a top hat or not. Good evening, sir, said the peeler to Mad Uncle Jack. Would you be kind enough to step down from your seat? He didn't ask to see Mad Uncle Jack's license and vehicle registration documents because they hadn't been invented yet, and he didn't ask him to take a breathalyzer test because he wasn't interested in finding out whether Mad Uncle Jack or his nose was drunk. This peeler had more important things to do. I'm looking for an escaped orphan, he explained. He ran away from St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. Ungrateful swine, snarled Mad Uncle Jack. Exactly what I said, agreed the peeler. I suggested that they change the name to St. Horrid's Home for Ungrateful Orphans when I heard the news. We must get up a collection to do that at once, said Mad Uncle Jack, who, once he liked an idea, seized upon it and wanted to act quickly. It shouldn't cost too much to change. You simply need to find a local painter to add the letters U and in front of the word grateful on the sign of the gate. I assume there is a sign at the gate. Oh, yes, indeed there is, sir, nodded the peeler. Good. I would imagine that a U and an N would not be too expensive, mused Eddie's great-uncle. I remember having an engraving made on the back of a watch for my beautiful wife some years back, and that only cost a farthing a letter. Speaking of which, I imagine that St. Horrid's has added new notepaper? The peeler nodded respectively. The coach driver was no ordinary coach driver. He was obviously a gentleman. So the headed paper will need to be altered from grateful to ungrateful also, said Mad Uncle Jack. No problem there, though. That could be a job for some of the ungrateful orphans themselves, up at 5 in the morning to write a few UNs before gratefuls on the headed note paper before going up chimneys or down mines or whatever it is the ungrateful little swine have to do for the rest of the day to earn their keep. A splendid solution, sir, beamed the peeler. After all, it had been his idea to change the name of St. Horrid's Home for Ungrateful Orphans, and here was a true gentleman agreeing with him wholeheartedly. Let me give you a contribution toward the campaign for such a name change, said Mad Uncle Jack. Well, sir, said the peeler a little hesitantly. Like all policemen, he had to be very careful about accepting bribes. What one person might see as a genuine contribution toward a legitimate and important cause, an investigating panel might see as a bribe to do, or not to do something. Then again, the peeler didn't want to upset this fine gentleman by not accepting whatever the amount was he was slipping out of his pocket. 10 shillings? A pound? 5 pounds? A dried electric eel? A dried electric eel? I'm sorry, I don't have a halibut to give you, said Mad Uncle Jack, but I spent my last one at the coaching inn. The policeman gave him a sideways glance that police officers, men and women, are very good at giving. It's a look that seems to say, I don't know what game you're is, but I know you're up to something and I intend to find out what it is. The peeler had never been so insulted in all his life. A dried electric eel? This was the worst bribe he'd ever had. He'd been given half an apple once, but at least he could give that to the police dog back at the station. But a dried electric eel? And to think that he'd thought this man was a gentleman. The peeler's attitude toward Mad Uncle Jack became decidedly chilly. I need to search the carriage for the orphan, he said, dropping the use of the sir. Do you have any objections to my doing so? Not at all, beamed Eddie's great-uncle. He had no idea what he had offered the peeler and thought that they were still bosom buddies. And who, might I ask, resides within the carriage? The peeler continued, walking toward one of its doors. My wife, Maud, the famous actor-manager, Mr. Pumblesnook, and my nephew's son, Edmund. I see, said the peeler, and no one else? Just Sally, said Mad Uncle Jack. A maid? Asked the peeler. A stuffed stoat, explained Mad Uncle Jack. I see, said the peeler. He looked through the open window in the carriage door to find one side of the carriage completely empty, and the three figures and a stuffed stoat squeezed into the other. He eyed the stuffed animal on Mad Aunt Maud's lap. Sally, I presume, he said. Maud, said Maud. I beg your pardon, said the peeler. I was referring to your stoat. His name is Malcolm, said Mad Aunt Maud. Eddie noticed the peeler raise an eyebrow, and that simple raised eyebrow seemed to say, here's a group of people who haven't got their story straight. They must be up to something. They must have something to hide. Of course, what the policeman had no way of knowing was that Mad Uncle Jack was mad and always called Malcolm Sally. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe Mad Aunt Maud was mad and always called Sally Malcolm. Maybe they were both mad, and the stoat's name wasn't Sally or Malcolm, but Cornelius or Edna. I see, said the peeler slowly. And who might you be, sir? I, said Mr. Pumblesnook, puffing his chest out and looking very grand, am the Empress of all China. You can probably guess what had happened. While we were following the action outside the carriage with Mad Uncle Jack and the peeler, Eddie, Mr. Pumblesnook, and Mad Aunt Maud were sitting in silence as it was their turn again. Life's not like that. They carried on talking, and at the same time that Eddie had agreed to his family honor to stay in the character of an orphan boy, the actor-manager had agreed to take on the character of the Empress of all China, and very good was he at it, too. Just because he was facing an officer of the law, Mr. Pumblesnook wasn't about to go back on his word, and back to who he really was. He had promised to play the Empress of all China, so the Empress of all China he would be. He didn't have an audience larger than the peeler, Mad Uncle Jack peering over his shoulder, Mad Aunt Maud and her stoat, and Eddie the orphan boy. But they were an audience, and this cramped seat was his stage. I am the Empress of all China, said Mr. Pumblesnook. It's worth noting that although China was no nearer or further away in miles than it is today, it was much farther away in time. Today you can jump on a plane to China or see the country and its people on television. Back then few people had been to China or met a Chinese person. Having said that, the peeler was in no doubt that this man was not the Empress of China. This man was a liar. I see, said the peeler. So far he had been confronted by a coach driver who was trying to make a fool of him by giving him a dried electric eel, a stoat called Sally, pretending to be a stoat called Malcolm, a woman claiming to be Maud, a grown man pretending to be a Chinese woman, which left a boy with blood all over his face, dabbing his nose with a hanky. The peeler pulled a notebook out of his top pocket and read what he had written only a few hours before on the visit to St. Hard's. Actually, I should swing. The missing orphan, a nasty boy, escaped a broken window. There was blood on the glass, and he must have cut himself. There was blood on the broken glass, and there was blood on the face of this boy trying to hide himself between two bulky grown-ups. And who, may I ask, are you? The peeler asked Eddie. The Tsar of Russia? The Queen of Sheba? Eddie gulped. No, sir, he said, trying to sound as orphaned as possible. I am a poor little orphan boy. The peeler leaned into the carriage, slid his fingers down the back of Eddie's collar, and pulled him out onto the road with one swift yank. Gotcha, said the peeler with a broad grin. There's nothing the police officer likes more than feeling a villain's collar, and in this book, escaped ungrateful orphans were villains, all right. In his book, villains were probably spelled villains. But what did spelling matter at a time like this? There's a nice warm cell waiting for you at the police station, he said. Then after that, you can go back to a nice cold one at St. Hard's. But that's my great-nephew, said a puzzled Mad Uncle Jack, watching the proceedings with interest. Eddie managed to twist his head around and look back into the carriage. He looked to Mr. Pumblesnook. hoping beyond hope that he would say that it was okay to be out of character now, to admit the policeman that he wasn't really an orphan, but no such luck. The Empress of all China gave him a little imperial bow, but said nothing. "I'm just a poor little orphan boy," said Eddie, no worry sounding in his voice. His family honor was at stake here. "My mistake," said his great-uncle, losing interest. "You look just like Edmund, and you were riding in my carriage, so I obviously thought you were my great-nephew." He turned to the peeler. "Feel free to take him away in shackles," he said. But, Eddie began to protest. Then the Empress of all China gave a stern call behind him, and he remembered his promise. The peeler wasn't sure what shackles were. He seemed to recall from Sunday school classes that slaves went around in shackles, so I guessed that they must be those skimpy loincloths slaves forced to wear instead of proper clothes. He thought he might get funny looks taking the escaped orphan back to the home in a skimpy loincloth, so he clapped him in irons instead. "Come on, lad," he said. "Mr. Cruelstreak will be glad to have you back under lock and key." Funnily enough, Mr. Cruelstreak didn't sound like a very nice man to Eddie, and how right he was. Episode 10, Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, in which Eddie wants out. Eddie hated the cell in the police station until he was taken out of the cell, propped into a cozy brown sack, and ended up in his room at the orphanage. The room at the orphanage was more like a cell, and the cell was. There most certainly wasn't enough room to swing a cat, nor that any cats in their right minds would have gone to the room in the first place. They'd have been too afraid of the rat. Notice I said rat, singular, not rats, as in lots, just the one, and Eddie was sharing his room with it. If it had been a cartoon rat, it would have been wearing an eye patch and would have had a great big tattoo on his arm. It might have even been chewing a match in the corner of his mouth. Because it was a real rat, it was just enormous and very frightening. It is true to say that, like wolves, rats have had a bad press. Whenever 3 little pigs' houses are blown down or a plague spreads across Europe, killing millions of people, either wolves or rats get the blame. Rats are, given the chance, probably very nice, clean, friendly, lovable creatures who smell gorgeous and would give half their money to charity if they earned enough. This particular rat, however, was none of the above. The rat was the sort of rat who lived up to the motto of St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. Now this would be a good time to tell you what that motto was. It would also be a good time to tell you who St. Horrid was. Saints are on the whole good people. That's how they came to be saints in the first place. There was one chap called Kevin who became a saint for sticking a hand out of his window. Well, there's more to it than that. He stuck his hand out of the window, probably to have a friend or wave to a friend or see if it was raining, and a bird landed on it, and thinking it was her nest, laid her eggs on it. All I can say is that he must have had a very hairy hand, or the bird was very nearsighted. Anyway, the bird thought his hand was a nest, and patiently on her eggs, waiting for them to hatch. The man waited too. Rather than moving his hand, he just stood there. He stood there until the eggs had hatched and the chicks had grown big enough to fly away. Then and only then did our man move. You can bet your life that the first thing he must have done is rush to the toilet. He must have been there for weeks with his hand out of the window, I mean not sitting on the loo. You can be equally sure that he must have had a terrible arm ache. Think how tiring it is when you put your hand out to answer a question and forget to put it down again because there's something far more interesting going on just outside the classroom window. Well, he was made a saint. Another good way of becoming a saint is by having terrible things done to you but remaining true to your beliefs. While someone called St. Horrid doesn't sound like the kind of person who would be kind to anyone or be very saintly at all, really, which is terribly unfair. You see, over time, names change and mistakes get made. There was once a ship called Mary Celeste, which was found drifting at sea with no crew on board. It was all very weird and wonderful, and people still talk about it and write books about it to this day, except that 9 times out of 10 they call it the Marie Celeste, with an I and an E instead of a Y at the end. even important reference books and books written by the very brainy people with huge dome-shaped foreheads and thick lensed glasses call it the Marie Celeste, but they're wrong. It's easy enough to find the right name if you go far enough back in records, but once the mistake was made, it was copied and copied and copied until the untruth became the truth. The same applied to St. Hard's. St. Hard's real name was St. Florid, and even that's not strictly true. His real name was Hank, but when he became a saint, he was named St. Hank the Florid, and this was shortened to St. Florid. Florid isn't short for Florida because no one had discovered North America yet except the native North Americans who were living there quite happily without Disney World or Burger King. Though the word florid means having a red complexion, and even in earlier times it meant flowery. In Hank the Florid's case, both meanings applied. Hank was a young lad in the days when kings still had silly names such as Ethelred the Smelly or Edward the Nutjob, and he was the son of a woodcutter. His mother was the woodcutter. The history books don't tell us what his father did. If you were the son of a woodcutter back then, you had two choices in life. Either you grew up to be a woodcutter yourself, or you died young. There were a variety of different reasons for why you might die. The lord and master might kill you for treading on his favorite patch of grass, or you might be sent to fight against some nasty foreign folk who were probably really a lot nicer than your own lord and master, but you'd no way of knowing. Or you might die of some really unimportant ailment, such as a nasty cough, because there were no proper doctors or medicine. But Hank didn't die young, and he didn't become a woodcutter either. He became a saint. The lives of saints are always rather hazy because they were written down a long time after the events are supposed to have happened, but the story of how Hank became a saint is well recorded. One day, Hank was out in the fields watering the goat. Not that goats need watering, but the history books are very clear on this point, so I should mention it, and thinking about beards. Perhaps he was thinking about beards because goats had beards. Perhaps it was because far more people had beards back then, because no one had invented a decent razor blade yet, or if they had, they hadn't told anyone else about it. Whatever the reason, Hank was thinking about beards when he stooped to pluck a single flower from the grass. He was putting the flower in his nose and giving it a jolly good sniff at the exact same moment as a queen bee came to land on it. The queen bee was out scouting for a new home, and if you know anything about queen bees, you'll know that where she goes, all the other bees follow. So before Hank knew it was happening, a huge swarm of thousands of bees came and landed on his chin and set up home there. From a distance, it looked like an enormous beard. Just then a huge enemy army came over the hill, and its leader, some books call him Simon the Fairly Nasty, and others Simon the Not So Nice, came galloping down toward Hank. The army had only recently landed, and Hank was the first person they had set eyes on from this country. When Simon the whatever his name was saw his man with a huge buzzing beard that seemed to change shape before his eyes, he turned and fled, taking his army with him. He's supposed to have said something clever like, "If the ordinary peasant in the field has such a magical and menacing beard, think how mighty his king must be." What he probably really said was, "Yikes, I'm getting out of here." Whatever he said, Simon and the enemy army were in such a hurry to leave that they all piled into one ship instead of the 5 they'd arrived in, and sank to the bottom of the sea. 4 bees, again, the history books are very clear about this, stung Hank. The whole swarm moved on, which doesn't usually happen once they've settled, leaving him with a red face and a crumpled flower in his hand, which is how he became St. Hank the Florid. The saint part came about because he'd saved his country from an enemy in a mysterious fashion, and there were mutterings about miracles. A passing monk had witnessed the whole affair. Hank spent the rest of his life living in a very comfortable cave called a hermitage, selling pots of honey to passing tourists. All was fine until about 300 years later, when someone wrote down his name as St. Hank the Horrid instead of Hank the Florid, and the name stuck. He became known as St. Horrid. So people who were nasty and horrid themselves adopted him as their saint, and that must have been how St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans got its name. The motto of the home was, "Work hard, get very dirty, be very unhappy." And from what Eddie could see of his room and the rat, it certainly lived up to it. Apart from the rat and his bed and himself, of course, the only thing in the room was, if you can remember that far back, a large book with "The Good Book" written on the front in faded gold letters. In Eddie's day, the Good Book was the name that many people gave to the Bible, so that's what he expected it to be. But when he opened the book, he found that it was full of, go on, have a guess. You'll never guess. It was full of pictures of food. There were big, colorful illustrations of cakes and trifles and fruit salads and pies and every other mouth-wateringly surpsicious thing you can think of. Just looking at it made Eddie feel hungry, and he'd only been in the orphanage a few hours. He wondered how the other kids felt, real orphans, if they had copies of the same book in their rooms. It was like torture looking at all these good-looking things. Lots of them sprinkled with chocolate or with cherries on top, knowing that all you'd eat was porridge made from old wallpaper paste or soup made from boiling up the remains of old leather shoes. Eddie had been tipped out of his sack and dragged through the kitchens on the way to his room, so he knew what to expect. There were teeth marks on some of the pictures, and in a few instances whole pictures appeared to have been eaten. Eddie imagined the previous occupant being so hungry that he had been forced to scoff pictures of puddings rather than the real thing. The previous occupant was, of course, the genuinely escaped orphan for whom Eddie had been mistaken. Because the bag Eddie had been delivered to, the orphanage, was so dirty, it must have had coal in it before him. Once he was stripped out of it, Eddie could have found it hard to recognize his own reflection. None of the staff seemed to notice he was the wrong boy, and he couldn't rely on his mad great-aunt and great-uncle to get him out of there. What should he do? Eddie was just beginning to think that there was no hope when he heard the scrape of the key in the lock, and the door swung open. The biggest woman Eddie had ever seen in his life filled the doorway. He looked up at her. "Well?" she demanded, anger blazing in her cruel red eyes. "Not very," said Eddie. "You see, there has been some terrible mistake." The woman hit him over the head with an enormous wooden spoon. "Well?" she repeated, but in capital letters this time. "Ouch, my name is Eddie Dickens. There has been some terrible mistake," Eddie blurted out, rubbing the lump that was already forming under his hair. "You know that you are supposed to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, Miss Cruel Streak, every time you have the pleasure of my company," said the woman. She was trying to speak as though she was the Queen of England, but she sounded more like how Eddie imagined the rat would talk if rats could talk. "Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, Miss Cruel Streak," said Eddie. "My name is Eddie Dick." Eddie couldn't continue because he found he had an enormous hand around his throat, and he was being lifted so high in the air that the bump on his head brushed against the filthy ceiling. "Where's your manners, boy?" snarled Miss Cruel Streak, dropping all pretense of being queen of anywhere except this terrible place. "Thought you could run away, did you? Thought you'd get away with it?" Eddie would have liked to explain that he hadn't run away from anywhere, but all he could say was "Furbulgwuch," which reminded him of his dear mother, who was forever stuffing onions into her mouth or sucking ice cubes shaped like famous generals. Tears poured down his cheeks. Obviously delighted that she'd made the boy cry, and satisfied at a job well done, Miss Cruel Streak released her grip around Eddie's neck, and he fell back down to the earth with a bump. She then bent down to give the rat a friendly scratch between the ears, in the same way you or I might pause to stroke a cat. This was a bad move on her part, because Eddie wasn't like the other boys and girls in St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. He wasn't weak from years of bad food, hard work, and no hope. Anyone who could survive a coach journey with mud and the stuffed stoat wasn't going to let his bully ruin his life. Without a moment's hesitation, he snatched up the good book in both hands, raised it high above him, and then brought it crashing down on Miss Cruel Streak's head. A look of complete and utter amazement passed across the enormous woman's face before she slumped unconscious to the floor, and on top of the startled rat. Eddie decided that it was best not to hang about. He closed the door to his room. Let's be honest, it was a cell, really, wasn't it? Behind him, and turned the key in the lock. The key was on a large iron ring, and hanging from the ring was dozens of other keys. Dozens of other keys. With those keys, he should be able to unlock most, if not all, of the rooms in St. Horrid's. He could go anywhere. He could free anyone. Yes, that's what he would do. He'd free the other orphans. He'd organize a mass breakout. Episode 11, the final installment. In which we rather hope that it's all well that ends well. Less than an hour had passed since Eddie had fled his cell, leaving Miss Cruelstreak locked up inside it, but the change that had come over the orphanage was incredible. St. Hard's was usually such a gloomy place that it would have been more fun to spend an evening in a coffin, with the lid taped shut, or to gnaw through your own leg, lightly sprinkled with salt and pepper, but not any more. There were laughter, whoops of joy, and shouting as more than 100 very grubby-looking kids who wouldn't have looked out of place in bags of coal up chimneys or dressed as blackboards at a fancy dress party were freed from their cells and were now charging all over the place. Girls and boys who had spent their whole lives being grateful, working hard, and having generally rotten time were now finding out what fun was for the first time. Not that any of them would have recognized the word fun if they tripped over it. Reading and writing were actively discouraged at the orphanage. They were thought to be a bad influence. What use were reading and writing to orphans? All they needed was to learn how to behave, respect their elders and betters, and live on as little food as possible. In fact, one of the first places the escaped children rushed to was the kitchens, but not to eat. There's nothing you and I would really like to think of as being proper food in there anyway. No, they poured into the kitchen like a swarm of ants down a crack between paving stones to give Cook a message. Cook was a very large man, with more warts on him than a toad, and the message the orphans gave him was a very simple one. They picked him up as if he weighed little more than a rag doll. There were lots of them, remember, turned him upside down, and plunged him headfirst into a huge vat of bubbling gruel. You may be sorry to hear that he survived this ordeal, and amazingly, the hot gruel actually cured him of his warts, but Cook didn't know these things would happen at the time. All he knew was that the horrible little children who were supposed to be locked in their rooms were on the rampage, and that he was now stuck in a cauldron, and he was very frightened and wished that they would go away, and go away they did. The army of orphans sensed that victory was in their grasp, but their army needed to arm itself. The obvious weapons were the famous St. Hard's home for grateful orphans cucumbers. These were not ordinary cucumbers. The worst things you can really say about an ordinary cucumber are that it doesn't really taste of much, that it can make your sandwiches go soggy, and that slices can sometimes get stuck to the roof of your mouth. Not the St. Hard's cucumber. That was a totally different animal. Which is just a saying, like when some people say that something is a totally different kettle of fish. They don't really mean that the thing is actually a kettle of fish, and I don't mean that the St. Hard's cucumber is actually an animal. When I say that it was a totally different animal, I mean that it was a totally different vegetable. Is that clear? Good. These particular vegetables were grown in the poor stony soil of the St. Hard's vegetable patch, and they were very hard. In fact, they were difficult to cut. In fact, they were almost rock solid unless you plunged them into water, brought them to the boil, and simmered them for about 47 minutes, stirring occasionally. But the grubby army of escaped orphans weren't interested in plunging them into water, bringing them to boil, simmering them for about 47 minutes, stirring occasionally. They were glad that these cucumbers were rock hard, because they made very good clubs, rather like the truncheons carried by police officers, who you may remember were called peelers back in the days of Eddie Dickens. Speaking of Eddie Dickens, what was he up to right there and then? Wielding a cucumber? Stuffing an upturned cook into a cauldron of his own gruel? No. Eddie was working on the next stage of his plan. It was one thing to get the grateful orphans out of their rooms, but they had to try and help them escape from the orphanage altogether. It was all fine and dandy that they should want to get their own back on all the people who had been so horrible to them over the years, but Eddie was thinking beyond that. He had to get them away from this nasty, nasty place and hide them somewhere where they wouldn't be found and brought back. This was why Eddie was now out in a yard with high brick walls on 3 sides and a huge locked gate on the 4th. The gate wouldn't be a problem because Eddie felt sure that one of the keys in the bunch of his hand would open it. He was more interested by what was in the yard. It was an enormous float. I don't mean one of those things that people take into the swimming pool with them when they're learning to swim, or one of the things that bobs around at the top of a milkshake. I mean a carnival float. A carnival float, a large cart that had been decorated to use in a carnival procession. This float had been made to look like a giant cow. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the more sensible ones among you are wondering what a carnival float designed to look like a giant cow is doing in the locked courtyard of an orphanage. It's certainly the sort of question that would cross my mind if I was reading the story and not writing it. Well, I'll tell you. The whole idea of the orphanage was to make money for Mr. and Miss Cruelstreak, but Mr. and Miss Cruelstreak couldn't really admit that, could they? They had to pretend that the whole idea of the orphanage was to care for the orphans. Now, there was a fairly popular belief at the time that strict rules, hard work, and not too many baths were good for orphans, but people would have been horrified to learn that the cruel streaks, didn't really care what was good for the children and what wasn't. The St. Hard's Home for Grateful Orphans was paid for by public donations. This meant that people who felt sorry for orphans or wanted to be seen to care about orphans paid the Cruel Streaks to look after them. What actually happened was that Mr. and Miss Cruel Streak spent nearly all this money on their own daughter, Angel, or themselves. The orphans got next to nothing, but the public didn't know that. When you rely on public donations, you have to have fundraising events, and that's where the carnival float, shaped like a giant cow, comes in. For hundreds of years, the countryside had been seen as a rather nasty place, full of wolves and highwaymen and people trying to sell you life insurance for your sleep. People much preferred to live in the conurbations, which is a big word for towns and cities. Recently, however, there had been a movement that said country air was good for you, and something equally good to come out of the country was milk. So the Cruel Streaks had their slaves, the orphans, that is, build them a carnival float that was designed to make people imagine that St. Hard's was a lovely place somewhere in the country where the lucky little kiddies got plenty of fresh air and milk, just the sort of orphanage you'd want to give money to. In fact, the float was to be used in money-raising events across the region. Less than 23.5 minutes after Eddie had first laid eyes on his giant cow on wheels and discovered that it was hollow, he had rounded up all the orphans, and they were piling inside it. Some of the children were sorry to leave, particularly those who Eddie had found in Mr. Cruelstreak's office, forcing the poor man to eat blotting paper. They left him tied to his own desk with a cord from his expensive velvet curtains, and with a large paperweight stuffed in his mouth like a baked apple in a boar's head, at a medieval banquet. He wouldn't be able to cry out for help in a hurry. Now that all of the children were hidden inside the giant hollow cow, Eddie was frantically hitching the float up to a cart horse he'd found in a stable. The horse had obviously been far better loved and treated than the orphans. It certainly had better food. In its stable were a starter, main course, and 3 choices of pudding, along with a selection of fine wines. Finally, Eddie was ready. He had to try several keys and the huge padlock on the gate before he found the right one. It was dark outside by then, but there was still enough of a moon in the sky to see by. Flinging the gate wide, Eddie jumped onto the back of the horse. The giant cow on wheels clattered across the courtyard, and out into freedom in the night. The next morning, when Eddie's great aunt, Mad Aunt Maud, woke, she was confused. For some reason or other, she and her husband, Mad Uncle Jack, had spent the night sleeping in their carriage rather than in some local hostelry, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't remember why. She had some vague recollection that it had something to do with the Empress of all China, or the actor-manager, Mr. Pumblesnook, and come to think of it, weren't they one and the same? Hadn't Mr. Pumblesnook been pretending to be the Empress, and Eddie pretending to be an orphan? Eddie, now what had happened to that nice young boy? That was it. It had turned out that he wasn't their great-nephew at all, but was really an escaped orphan. He had been taken away by a peeler, that was it. It was all too confusing. Mad Aunt Maud's head was in a spin at the best of times, but that morning it was a whirl. Where was Malcolm? What had happened to Malcolm? She frantically looked around inside the carriage in the early morning light. Her eyes fell on her stuffed stoat, and her pulse returned to normal. There he was, safe and well. "Good morning, Malcolm," she said, with obvious relief. "My name is Jack," Mad Uncle Jack reminded her, coming out of a light sleep. "I was talking to my stoat husband," Mad Aunt Maud explained, the trimmed stoat hairs having fallen from her ears in the night and restored her hearing. What with her head in a whirl and having slept in an upright position, she had a terrible neck-ache. It felt as if one had stuck a hat pin in the side of her neck. "But I thought your stoat was called Sally," he protested. "I've always called her Sally, Sally Stoat. It is a he and not a she, and his name is Malcolm," Maud pronounced. "You never cease to amaze me, O wife of mine," said my Uncle Jack with pride. Pulling a hat pin from the side of her neck, he kissed the spot where it had been. The pain went almost instantly. "How did that get in there?" she asked. "You were snoring in the night, and the Empress of all China stabbed you with it," Mad Uncle Jack explained. "These Chinese are full of all the mysteries of the Orient. She called it an acupuncture." "Did it work?" asked Maud with interest. "After you stopped screaming and we stemmed the flow of blood," said Uncle Jack. "I'm surprised you don't remember it." "I must admit I'm feeling a little groggy this morning," said Maud. "There's a lot I don't recall. Where's the Empress now?" Jack looked down at the floor of the carriage and pointed. Mr. Pumblesnook was asleep at their feet. Another Chinese custom? Asked Aunt Maud. More a lack of space, said her husband. Now, if you will excuse me, I must get some air. With that, he stepped over the sleeping figure of the actor-manager, opened the door, and climbed down onto the rutted track. And can you guess who or what he came face to face with? No marks for those of you who said a giant hollow cow on wheels. He came face to face with Eddie's mother and father, Mr. and Miss Dickens. Their clothes looked singed and their faces were slightly sooty, but that wasn't what Uncle Jack noticed first and foremost. You're not yellow anymore, he said in an obvious wonderment. No, smiled Mr. Dickens. You're not a bit crinkly about the edges, said mad Uncle Jack, stunned. He stopped and sniffed the crisp morning air with his beak-like nose. And you don't smell of old hot water bottles, he gasped. No, said Mr. and Miss Dickens as one, with big happy grins on their faces. Dr. Muffin is a genius. He cured us. All it took was burning down our home and everything in it. The combination of chemicals and all the smoke we breathed in was just what we needed. We're fine now. Splendid, splendid, said Mad Uncle Jack, smoothing down his hair, which was sticking up all over the place after a night spent in the carriage. But what brings you here? We're here to collect Eddie, said Eddie's father. We expected you to have reached Awful Inn by now, but as luck would have it, we've caught up with you already. Eddie, frowned Mad Uncle Jack, as though he was trying to remember where he'd misplaced a pair of spectacles or rather an unimportant piece of cheese. Our son? Said Miss Dickens, cautiously, without so much as a famous general-shaped ice cube or an onion in her mouth to muffle her speech. Now that we're cured, there's no need for you to look after him any more. Precisely, agreed Mr. Dickens. Ah, I see, said Mad Uncle Jack. The problem is that you were mistaken. The boy you gave over to our care was not your son Edmund at all, but an escaped orphan. He admitted it himself. I remember it quite clearly now. Not Jonathan? Said Eddie's mother in amazement. I'm sure I'd know if he was my own son or not. How unfortunate, said Mad Uncle Jack. At that moment, Mr. Pumblesnook rolled out of the open door of the carriage, landed and splat in the mud, and woke up with a theatrical roar. Who dares to kick me from my own bed? He demanded, in capital letters, in the same voice he'd used to such great effect on the stage when playing Dr. Pompous in a popular play, Royal Rumpus. Then he leapt to his feet. Eddie's mother and father had never met Mr. Pumblesnook before, so were quite intimidated by his big hulk of a man with a barrel chest and booming voice. This is the Empress of all China, and these are Edmund's parents, said Uncle Jack, making the introductions. It seems that Edmund really was Edmund after all, he told the theatrical. A most unfortunate mishap. My name is Pumblesnook, Pumblesnook explained. I have merely been in the character of the Empress this past day or so. It is indeed an honor to meet the parents of Master Edmund, a boy with obvious— Forgive me for interrupting, Miss Dickens interrupted, but where is our boy now? In some orphanage somewhere, said Mad Uncle Jack. Saint Moribunds, Saint Solid, Saint Poorly, I'm afraid. I don't recall. I wouldn't worry. You can always get a new one. A new one? Said Mr. Dickens, puzzled. Another boy, said Mad Uncle Jack. Oh, Eddie's father nodded. What brings you to this neck of the woods, sir, madame? Asked Mr. Pumblesnook, wiping his mud spatters from his jacket with the kerchief that had so impressed Eddie when he first laid eyes on the actor-manager in the stable of the Coaching and Coaching Inn. We sent Edmund to stay with my dear aunt and uncle because we are ill and we don't want him to catch whatever the disease was we had, began Miss Dickens. But now we are cured, there is no need for him to stay away from us, so we're here to take him home, said Miss Dickens. Mr. Dickens, taking up the story. We caught the train and planned to walk the last mile or so to Awful Inn, which is how we came to catch up with the carriage so quickly. Mr. Pumblesnook wiped away the last of the mud with a dramatic flourish, shook his kerchief, and returned it to his breast pocket, where it sprouted from the top like some exotic flower. How are you cured? He asked with interest. Our good doctor, the notorious Dr. Muffin, burnt our house down with us inside it, said Eddie's mother, the pride sounding in her voice. We don't know whether it was the fear of being burnt to a crisp or the effects of the wood smoke, but either way he cured us. A truly remarkable tale, boomed Mr. Pumblesnook, obviously impressed. But I do have one question. Yes, said the Dickenses. You say there is no need for young Master Edmund to stay at Awful Inn now? Yes, nodded the Dickenses. But he can come home with you after all? Dickens nodded again. But did you not most recently inform me that your house was, in your own words, if my recollection serves me correctly, was burnt to the ground? Inquired the wandering theatrical. Mr. Dickens looked at Miss Dickens. Miss Dickens looked at Mr. Dickens. By Jove, he wailed, we haven't thought of that. Eddie's mother let out a plaintive wail and crumpled to the ground. Her husband found that the easiest way to calm her was to fill her mouth with acorns. It reminded her of some of Dr. Muffin's earlier attempts at remedy, and it strangely comforted her. Bad Aunt Maud, meanwhile, was the last to emerge from the carriage. With Malcolm tucked firmly under one arm, the hat pin protruding from the stuffed stoat's nose, she walked around to the front of the vehicle. Suddenly she recalled why they'd had to spend the night sleeping in the carriage rather than being driven the last few miles home. They had no horse. It was that Uncle Jack had left the horse in a bathroom or anything like that this time. Early on the previous evening, the horse had bolted, run away, legged it, call it what you will. Luckily for Mad Uncle Jack, on top of the occupants within, the horse hadn't bolted with the carriage still attached. It had somehow broken free, and before Uncle Jack had time to catch up the startled creature, it had run, in the words of a popular little ditty, over the hills and far away. Note that I described the horse as having been a startled creature. Startled by what? By the Dickinsons' faithful servants, Gibbering Jane and Dawkins? Admittedly, they did look quite a sight. They'd traveled on the train with Eddie's parents, but because they weren't servants, they'd traveled on the outside and were still covered with bits of gorse bush and splinters of telegraph pole that they'd rubbed up against the train had gone hurtling along. But no, they'd only appeared on the scene the next morning. I'm talking about what startled Mad Uncle Jack's horse the night before. Mad Aunt Maud knew what it was. She was staring at the culprit right there and then. Just over a hedge in a field by the road was the largest cow she had ever seen in her life. The moment she laid eyes on it, she fell in love. It was like the first time she had ever seen Malcolm, in a shop filled with second-hand stuffed animals. Ignoring all else around her, Mad Aunt Maud stumbled across the muddy road and up to the hedge. On tiptoe, she could just reach the carnival float's cow's black muzzle. She gave it a friendly pat. "Hello," she said. "I shall call you Marjorie." She followed the hedge until she reached the gate, then entered the field. To say that Eddie's parents were surprised when Mad Aunt Maud emerged at the side of the carriage some 10 minutes later, followed by Eddie and a crowd of some of the grubbiest children any of them had ever seen, would be an understatement. Miss Dickens rushed forward and threw her arms around her son. "Where'd you come from?" she asked, her mouth still crammed with acorns. It was just like old times. I think she was saying, "Where did you come from?" Mad Aunt Maud looked far from happy. "I caught them out climbing out of a cow's bottom," she explained, a stern look on her face. "Disgraceful behavior, if you ask me. Poor Marjorie's standing in that field, minding her own business. The last thing she needs is a gang of children climbing out of her bottom." But no one, and I include Eddie, was listening. He was so excited to see that his parents were cured and to hear the news about the destruction of his home. Mr. Pumblechook was delighted by the arrival of the 100 or so orphans. "Young blood," he said. "That's what my strolling band of theatricals needs. Young blood. You children are my future. Think of all the plays I will be able to perform now with you in the crowd scenes. The audience will love it. Think of the drama and the murder in Julius Caesar." The children, who had all had a good night's sleep in the giant cow, had even woken up when Uncle Jack's horse had spotted the monster and made a bid for freedom, were feeling excited and refreshed. They had no idea what Mr. Pumblechook was on about, because they had no idea that he was an actor-manager, but at the mention of murder they all brandished their St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans cucumbers in the air, and then brought them down on Mr. Pumblechook in a rain of blows. "Excellent!" he cried, fending off his attackers with glee. "You have such spirit!" And that, gentle readers, is really an end to it, and though the title of this book includes the words "awful end," it is not an awful one for the Dickens family. With their own home gone, Mr. and Miss Dickens and Eddie moved into Awful End, the idea being that it would be a temporary measure until their own home was rebuilt. As it happened, their family still lives there today. The escaped orphans did indeed join Mr. Pumblechook's band of strolling theatricals, and although they had to put up with Mr. Pumblechook's irritating way of speaking and the fact that she still picked the blotches off her face and kept them in the pocket of her dress, it was a good life. Because a big part of being a strolling theatrical is the strolling. They were always on the move. The peelers never caught up with them. One or two of the orphans grew up to be very good actors, and if you're ridiculously old, you might even be familiar with some of their names. Mad Uncle Jack soon tired of sharing his house with Eddie and his parents, so he built himself a tree house in the garden. He made it from the dried fish that he hadn't used to pay his hotel bills. To begin with, he had trouble from the neighborhood cats, but soon discovered that once the fish were painted with creosote, which is designed to stop fences from rotting, the smell went and the cats lost interest. Aunt Maud lived in the garden of Offland, too, or to be more accurate, she lived inside Marjorie, in the garden of her former home. With Malcolm the stuffed toad, of course. When she died at the ripe old age of 126, she was buried inside Marjorie under the rosebed. There she remained for over 82 years until she was dug up to make room for a swimming pool. And what of Eddie, the hero of this tale? Well, his adventures weren't quite over yet. History had more in store for Edmund Dickens, savior of the orphans of St. Horrid's, but that, as all the best writers say, is another story. The end for now. Thank you for listening to A House Called Awful and Book 1 of the Eddie Dickens Trilogy by Phillip Ardagh. And it was published in 2000, but I think I actually bought this book in 2004, although I'm not entirely certain. I know that I read it when I was a kid, and I believe I actually read the book on the way back to the U.S. I think. Anyway, thank you for listening. Let me know if there was any parts that you particularly liked.